This is the Study Commission on Deterring Sex Offenses Against Children Task Force, SR 167 from the 2022 legislative session. Madam Secretary, if you would please call the roll.
Yes, ma'am. Senator Barrow,
Present.
Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Cusimato,
Present.
Ms. Lamadre,
Present.
Ms. Lowbray,
Present.
Mr. Reingold.
Present.
You have 5 present.
Okay. What's the quorum number?
You know,
5 members present.
we don't have.
5 members present. Okay, members, we will go ahead and get started. We don't quite have a quorum to take any action, but we can discuss the items. We do have a number of individuals here today to actually testify. But before we actually call them up, I actually spent a little time just kind of looking over our current law as it relates to chemical castration. We are one of about maybe 7 or 8 states that actually do this at this moment. And what I noticed, there were a lot of questions that I had as it relates to what we are doing in this space. And I did send a note to the Department of Correction to get some information from them. And so what I've decided to do, we're going to take all our testimony today, but I will have DOC to come to our next hearing to share with us what they are doing in this space. How are we helping individuals to rehab as we are expecting them to come back into society? And what does that look like even within the 4 walls of prison? And so, like I said, I had a lot of questions as I kind of read through the law, just wondering how many individuals have actually chosen to do chemical castration. I have not been able to get any of that information as of yet, but by the time we have our next hearing, we will. I will also say that we have to come up with what we plan to do by March 15th. That's when this study will actually conclude. And so I would like to ask any members who are interested in helping me to develop, if we decide to do legislation or if we just decide to turn in a report, if individuals be willing to help me put that together following our conclusion of the task force, and if we deem it necessary to continue beyond our work here after March 15th. So with that said, I believe that we have, well, I think the PowerPoint is working, but we do have we have it here before us. We have Ms. Dr. Shannon Smith with us. If you would, please introduce yourself.
My name is Shannon Smith. I'm a licensed professional counselor, so I'll correct you in that I'm not a doctor.
Okay, all righty.
I think
We
that
did give
I
you
think
a
we get that
promotion.
often. Yes. I am a licensed professional counselor. I work in private practice in Baton Rouge, but I also work as a contract provider for both STAR, serving survivors in a weekly support group, and in a local psychology clinic where I work with offenders. And I run 5 treatment groups every month in Hammond, and I've been doing that more than the groups in Hammond, but I've been providing services to people who have offended since 2015. So.
Okay, great. And all of the programs that you provide are in Hammond?
Right now, yes, I'm in Hammond, but I have previously provided group services in New Orleans, Kenner, Port Allen, Gonzales, and Baton Rouge.
Okay,
So I have worked in almost every office that Dr. Romano, it's Brandon Romano that I work for in that practice, and he serves a large kind of portion of West Baton Rouge, East Baton Rouge, Tangipahoa, and Jefferson and Orleans Parish.
Okay, so I'm going to hold off any other questions and just let you go through your PowerPoint presentation because maybe you will answer some of my
I
questions
will likely
there.
answer some questions, yes.
Okay.
And I think that they're working on something for the PowerPoint.
Okay. Do you have it before you? You could just kind of talk
I
from
do,
it?
yeah.
Okay.
So I wanted to start with, when we talk about sex offender in general, and Morgan has probably heard me say this before, sex offender is a term that is a legal term. It is not a clinical term. So when we talk about somebody who has committed sexual offenses or a sex offender, that has to do with the legal implication that they have committed a crime against a child of a sexual nature or an adult of a sexual nature. There is no common profile when it comes to people who commit sexual offenses. And again, this is a legal classification that we give people, not a clinical one. It's a very diverse group of people. It's representative of all ages, diverse backgrounds, socioeconomics, genders, religion, and every form of functioning that you can think of. So it's really difficult to determine how this group of individuals, people who have committed sexual offenses, are different from any other criminal group, but also different from any other group in society. And the traditional typologies that you may have heard of, situational molester, preferential molester, pedophile, rapist, power rapist, those kinds of classifications don't give us a whole lot of information about what's best practice for that person's treatment or their risk to recidivate. So it's really important that we kind of keep that stuff in mind. Just some generalizations, 90 to 95% of people who commit sexual offenses are male, but that means that we have female offenders and people who identify in other genders. And this has probably come from a while ago. I think that we are seeing more people who identify with non-binary or transgender identities. Female offenders are a little different. They are more likely to offend with another person. So if we're talking about interpersonal violence, we see a lot of instances where the male and the female couple might perpetrate against a child or children. And females are more likely to have younger victims than males. It's very rare to see a female who offends against an adult, per se. Sex offenders do have the lowest recidivism rate of all crime types, and I know that that shocks a lot of people when they hear that, but most people who commit a sexual offense and are caught and convicted rarely commit another. That doesn't mean they don't get arrested for other things, but those are rarely sexual offenses. And our residencies and restrictions around where people can live and registrations don't do a whole lot to keep us safe. They do kind of give us a sense of safety, but there's really no research that says that sex offender registries and those residency restrictions have made an impact on perpetration. So I have heard this has come up, and I wanted to address it. There's a myth that most people who perpetrate violence were victims themselves. And the truth is that only around 1/3 that we know of were sexually abused themselves. And the vast majority of people who are sexually abused do not go on to sexually abuse other people. I think Morgan can speak to, the prevalence of sexual violence, and working with survivors for as long as I have, we know very few who go on to perpetrate, particularly those who have sought our help. So some common characteristics among people who have committed sexual violence might be that there is some deviant or sexual arousal or interest or preference. There might be cognitive distortions, but big clue, we all have cognitive distortions. So again, they're not different than anyone else. There may be intimacy deficits, loneliness, lack of emotional support, poor family backgrounds. If you're at all familiar with the ACEs study, individuals in this population are going to have high ACEs scores. They have very adverse childhoods, for the most part, not all. They may have poor coping skills and empathy deficits, impulse control issues, some mental health needs, but usually those are around depression and anxiety. There may be some serious mental illness, and that's a different population than we normally see who is released to the public. And I'm not really speaking today on, because it's not my area of expertise, people who are adjudicated for mental illness and placed in psychiatric hospitalization centers. There may be substance abuse in their history. So I want to, on this slide, if you look at possible characteristics on your handout, I want to point out that on here, when we're talking about prevention, there are a lot of areas here that could be targeted in terms of prevention and early childhood intervention. We can teach coping skills in the schools. We can teach impulse control in schools. We can address ACEs. We can provide more services to kids whose parents are incarcerated or have mental health or substance issues. So there's a lot that we can address at the prevention level in general in our population, in our society. And so a lot of these characteristics can be addressed early on for all people. So I just wanted to point that out. And I'll try to do that as we go through and talk about prevention, because I know that that's important to all of us. I think I would love to put myself out of a job if it had to do with ending perpetration of sexual violence, and I think the rest of you would like that too. Some key differences for people who have committed sexual violence, why they do it and why they continue to do it are different for everybody. Their victim preferences are different. The types of offenses, their own strengths, their own assets, their treatment needs, their supervision needs are different. Their willingness to engage in treatment is very different, and their risk to reoffend is different. So each individual is going to have different risk factors and different perpetration factors and different treatment factors, or factors that figure into their success. So I have a background in victim advocacy. I was a victim advocate for 15 years before I ever decided to work with people who have offended. And back then, if somebody asked me, why do they do what they do? I would say, I don't know, and I don't care, because that's someone else's job, right? And then I realized how much of the picture I was missing if I wasn't working with people who were offended, or I didn't understand that part of the population. And it was a job working in a supervision unit in probation as a victim advocate that really spurred me on to want to work with this population, because I felt like they really need people who are working with them and providing quality services. So we now know, or I now know, a little bit more about why people offend, and it's not what we think. Sometimes, yes, it is about sexual interest or arousal. Sometimes it's about power and control. A lot of times it's about emotional problems. It's about impulse control. It's about thinking errors. It's acting out anger. It's being impulsive. It's trying to feel better in the moment, particularly when we talk about child pornography and other internet-based crimes. And sometimes it's just about somebody who has delinquency and criminal attitudes. So again, it's a diverse answer. It's not an easy answer. And understanding motives for why somebody offends does not eliminate their accountability, right? So this study is about people who offend against children. So let's talk a little bit about those people who offend against children. Just like the whole group of people who offend, they're very diverse. We have different socioeconomic backgrounds, different genders, different marital status, different sexualities represented. They may have poor social skills, feelings of inadequacy or loneliness. They may be passive in their relationships. They may not be. Most know the victim. and they have access to the victim through various sources, including their own families, friendship circles, and sometimes jobs or volunteer positions. Stranger on stranger child molestation is rare. And that's the one everyone seems to fear, but we forget that most sexual violence involving children as victims is occurring within the child's own home or the home of someone they know. And that's really important to keep in mind, because we like to think about the monster kind of being out there, but it's a lot closer to home. And that makes dealing with that person a lot different. Pedophilic versus non-pedophilic. So pedophilia is a psychiatric diagnosis. We often refer to people who have committed crimes against children as pedophiles. This is an inaccurate use of that term, unless they are sexually attracted to children in a persistent and bothersome way to them. Those are some of the criteria for the diagnosis. Most people who offend against children are not pedophiles, and many of them are just situational abusers. That's the child or that's the victim that they had access to. So most crimes are committed in a way, and I'm not even talking about sexual crimes, but most crimes are committed in the easiest route possible. So if I leave my car door unlocked and somebody opens the door and steals from me, they would rather do that than break my window. If the door is locked, I've got one level of defense. So when it comes to child sexual abuse, a lot of times it's just that the child was the most available person. All right, there's a slide I'd like you to look at. It's kind of hard to see on your copy, but it's about the comprehensive approach to sex offender management. And this diagram shows how a collaborative effort to dealing with sex offenders is the most effective one. We have at the top our investigation, prosecution, and disposition. We have assessment, supervision, treatment, reentry, and registration and community notification. So this applies to those people who are being released from prison and are going to be in our communities. The fundamental principles are that this should be victim-centered. I think that my background in victim advocacy and also serving victims and survivors while I serve those who have committed offenses keeps me really balanced and allows me to always be thinking from a victim's point of view. And that's my background. It requires specialized knowledge and training, public education, like y'all are doing now, like you're being educated and you're hopefully going to educate the public that you serve, monitoring and evaluating our services, but also the offenders, and then collaboration together. Right now, we don't have all of these things working in collaboration like we should. There are elements of it that are working, but they're working piecemeal. I have a good relationship with the probation officers I work with in Tangi, but that doesn't mean that I know much about the prosecutors in the cases or the judges or the victim services agency being at the table when I'm providing services. So supervision and treatment are often working together pretty well, but we don't always work well with reentry, which would be really important, or the state police, which runs our registry. So these might be some areas that as a state we could look at improving services. When it comes to assessment, the vast majority that I know of people who commit state-level crimes of a sexual nature do not receive individual evaluations or assessments. And that is key, as we'll go on, that is key to providing the kind of treatment that's going to meet their needs best. Now, federal offenders do receive an individual evaluation because the federal government pays for that. On the state level, offenders are responsible for their treatment, for paying for it, as well as for their supervision, paying for probation fees, and their registration, notification, those kinds of things. So there are very few, if any, offenders that I know that could afford to pay for an evaluation. And that's an area I think that the state could spend some time and money looking into, really providing good assessments I know in the state of, I don't know all states, but I know in the state of Arkansas, where I'm a member of ATSA, their Association for the Treatment of Sexual Abusers and Prevention of Sexual Assault, every person coming out of DOC in Arkansas receives an evaluation, and that's how they determine what level they are reported on the sex offender registry, a tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, how much notification they need to do to the community, and what their treatment looks like. That's, our neighbor to the north. So I know that that's what Arkansas is doing. It seems to me a pretty smart model. I don't know how they pay for it, but I know that it's happening through DOC, that those evaluations are taking place there.
Before you go any further, about on average, how much is an assessment?
I know that when I have asked for one kind of low cost, it was about $800. So that's the low cost one. I think in general, they're more than $1,000.
Okay, thank you.
And that's with a private provider. I don't know how much the federal government is contracting them for. So that might be another area to research. I'm sure that information's public somewhere. Okay, so I did want to point out that I think that we could be doing things a lot better in the state. There are lots of states with really good models of using this collaborative model. The one in Connecticut, which was the one I was trained under, uses this model pretty well. I was employed by the state sexual assault victim services agency, but I was housed at a probation office and attended all treatment groups, was involved in reunification of families, emergency plans. So just embedding a victim advocate in a probation office is an amazing kind of asset. Connecticut is a small state, so we were able to do it pretty easily, but it's not without its flaws, because each person kind of has allegiance to their organization, and it took me a while to embed myself into probation and show that I was a worthy ally to them. But that was a victim advocate within probation, and I think Colorado does the same, but it's through their Department of Probation and Parole that they have victim advocates. So that's another area I think that we could look at improving services here. So when it comes to treating sex offenders, the objective is, of course, to prevent the reoccurrence of sexually abusive behaviors. We want to manage their risks and their risk factors. We want to develop their strengths and competencies, identify the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that played a part in their behavior, in their offending behavior, and to help them to establish meaningful, stable, pro-social lives. Most of these men, and I'll say men because the majority of the people I work with are men, most of these men are working, have families, are members of society. They want to vote. They, and thanks to, I think I saw Chico walk in, thanks to people like Chico, they're able to vote again. So they're very active people in our community, and they want to be active members of society. Best practices in treatment are cognitive behavioral therapy. That's when we talk about thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and making that connection. Risk, need, and responsivity principles, R&R. That matches the individual's risk level, and this is where that assessment would be handy, because we can tell what this individual's level of risk is and match their treatment to their risk level. So right now, for instance, with our groups, our clients come to group once a month for 2 hours. Other jurisdictions may do it differently. Very few of them receive individual treatment, and that's probably because it's just a cost inhibitive, service for them. They're ordered to attend sex offender treatment, and the easiest, most cost-effective way to do that is in a group. So they come to group once a month for 2 hours, and for many, that's even outside of their comfort level in terms of cost. We also are keeping people in treatment for the length of their supervision in most places. There are people who are released to the public who have lifetime supervision. Keeping somebody in treatment for their life is not ethical and it's not effective. We have kind of a place where the maximum benefit is going to be reached in treatment, and after that time, those benefits start to wane off. You know, it's kind of like if you kept going to work and they kept saying, we'll pay you next week, eventually you would stop going to work because there's no incentive to keep going back. So matching people's individual risks to what we provide would be a great place for us to start again as a state. We are addressing skills building. We're talking about really complex topics in our groups, but it would be best to be able to tailor some of those interventions to what individual people need. And over time, you know, I start to learn my clients a little bit, and I can know a little bit more about them and what they need, but I'm still limited by what I can do in a group because it's got to be applicable to most of the people in the room. We also have a model called the Good Lives model. The Good Lives model is a strength-based approach. So it's not just about what to avoid in life, but it's what to approach. The premise is that people who commit crimes do so because they're trying to meet a need. And if you've ever had a child who acts up and you hear somebody say, well, he just wants attention, you know, and you say, well, it's bad attention. He's getting in trouble, but attention is attention, right? He's choosing the wrong way to get attention. And this is the Good Lives model. It's saying that person committed this crime to meet some need. And if we could teach them better ways to meet that need, then they could live more productive and healthy lives. I heard in the last meeting people kind of talking about what does somebody do for treatment if they have not committed a crime and they want help. So there are a few internet-based programs that I listed under the voluntary treatment options. Before You Act, Virtuous Pedophiles, and everybody hates that name, by the way. The ASAP, which is the Association for Sexual Abuse Prevention, Help Wanted, and Troubled Desire. These are all internet-based programs. Some offer peer support. Others offer more lengthy programs that somebody can go through. Troubled Desire is located in Germany, and the doctor who runs that is one of the most respected professionals. When I kind of reached out for information on chemical and surgical castration, he had the most information because Germany has a program, a voluntary program, where there are a number of individuals who have undergone surgical and chemical castration, and they were able to study those individuals. So Germany has some data that we don't have. But Troubled Desire is an internet-based self-management program, so it's something that somebody can go through on their own. Most of these, like you can see, are self-help or help with from peers, because as you mentioned in your last meeting, there is always the concern about if I go to a treatment provider, are they going to call DCFS or some other organization on me? And I think that that's a line that each of us as treatment providers has to be really honest with our clients about up front. And there are lots of things that don't have to be reported because they're not reportable, but there are some things that are going to have to be reported. And so that does keep some people from seeking treatment. Not just because somebody comes into treatment and says, I'm thinking about this, or I have a desire, or I'm bothered by, does not mean that they meet that threshold to be reported to DCFS. Now, if they identify a victim and it seems very likely, or we even have suspicion that it could happen, then we would have to report that, and we would have to be really honest with our client. So that does keep a lot of people out of treatment before committing an offense. And that is another area I think that we could look at. It's probably going to have to be a national discussion about mandated reporting, because mandated reporting has a really important service and a really important need, and it came about for really important reasons. So we don't want to just throw the baby out with the bathwater, but we might want to look at kind of other ways to deal with that. I know that around interpersonal violence, domestic violence, there have been some different reporting issues that have come up, and education about what needs to be reported, what doesn't need to be reported. Now, again, that is an adult victim, but we may want to continue a conversation with children's services agencies, child welfare protection agencies around that. But right now, there are some internet-based treatment options for people. So when it comes to recidivism, risk for recidivism varies on lots of different factors, but sexual offenders are more likely to be reconvicted for a non-sexual offense than for a sexual offense. These are violations of probation, these are failure to pay their dues, these are failure to go to treatment, it might be drugs or alcohol or a gun charge or some other charge that's violent, but it's not often another sexual offense. Reconviction rates are lower than for the general criminal population. And I do want to report that low reporting and conviction rates are also a factor. You know, there are a lot of people that we just don't ever catch in the criminal justice system that are committing crimes against children and crimes against adults that we just will never see in treatment or in the criminal justice system because believability is still an issue for victims asking for help. So I do believe that sexual abuse prevention is a public health issue, and it requires a really comprehensive collaborative approach. If we just looked at it from the financial point of view, we're spending a lot of money on rehabilitation and services to victims that we could be spending on prevention. We need to target issues that are really more likely to increase that person's likelihood of perpetration, as well as their likelihood of victimization. That goes back to those ACEs studies and really providing good services to at-risk youth. Comprehensive education on sexual abuse, body autonomy, the dynamics of healthy and unhealthy relationships. I know that that came up in your last meeting, but it can't be stressed enough. And I know that as a former community educator, how hard it is to get into schools to talk to children about sex. And we're not talking about voluntary sex, we're talking about sex that is forced on them. And their parents still didn't want us to talk about it. So that's really an issue I think that we need to be tackling, because kids should know their body parts and should be empowered to say no and to tell somebody and know that they'll be believed. We need intervention and treatment methods that are based on sound research and data, like the ones I mentioned earlier. And then we need policies and laws that are informed by sound research and data. There's a couple of programs around sexual abuse prevention that I wanted to highlight. One is called Stop It Now, and the other is Darkness to Light. These are two programs that offer tips for parents and for those who work with children on sexual abuse prevention and safety training. These are two really good organizations, and maybe a way that we can start some of that prevention effort in communities, schools, churches, and other organizations. And then lastly, I left you with some resources, ATSA, CSOM, which is a program that's no longer in office or no longer running. I guess their funding ended, but they've got some good comprehensive assessment protocols and strategies for sex offender management. Those are long documents that are really full of information. Some of them talk about states that are doing things that are working. And then, of course, the SMART office, which is the office that runs our sex offender registries federally and those kinds of programs. So I am finished. If you want to ask questions, I'm happy to answer.
Well, thank you so very much, Ms. Smith. A very thorough presentation, I may add. There are a couple of things that did kind of take me off guard a little, I must admit. So I did not realize the low recidivism rate.
Right. Studies tell us it's around 5 or 6%. It's very low.
So I'm wondering, though, in part, if that is because how individuals maybe actually, may take plea bargains, or if they may actually charge them with a lower when they're arrested. They are charged with something less than. I'm just wondering if that's part of the factor.
I don't know exactly what studies were used, but usually those studies are based on the criminal behavior versus the conviction. So if it was sexual in nature, it would normally be charged or written down in this research as a sexual crime. But that's a good question. We do know that a lot of offenses are pled down to a lesser charge. That doesn't happen as often with sexually based crimes as it does with others, and it happens, I think, more with certain populations, and that means maybe people with better access to representation, better financial status, maybe on college campuses. I know that we've had this issue with sexual assaults being reported. In my day, they were all kind of filed under, can't remember, miscellaneous, kind of undetermined crime. So even with the Clary Act on college campuses, they may not be being reported, but the vast majority of people that I have worked with, they weren't offered a big plea deal. So I don't see it happening a lot in Louisiana in terms of plea deals that are lesser than a sexual offense.
Well, I will say that I have heard that being one of the issues and one of the maybe possible problems that we've had in terms of how when they are arrested, how they are actually, how it's actually what charge they actually receive, and then sometimes to get a better sentence or not be sentenced at all, then they plead to something else a lot less. But we can definitely talk about that a little bit more. The other thing that really caught my attention was, and not that I'm really surprised about that, but it seemed like we should be doing more in this area if the data shows it's mostly about people that they know. It's somebody that they know. So to me, we need to be really educating and preparing people and telling them how to, when they have been offended, when abused, how to go about making sure they report it. And that still brings up another concern for me, especially when I think about a lot of the work that we did with the universities, and I'm not quite sure that I feel real comfortable with where we are right now today, with young ladies being able to report, those reports being taken seriously, and action being taken. So that to me still seems like it's still an issue and a problem that we still need to address. But to me, seems like we should be doing more in that area to help, especially younger victims. Of what to recognize, what to say. And I think that's one big problem that we have. I'm not surprised, again, that it is by people that they do know.
Right. And if I might add, I think a lot of that education has to happen with the adults, because it's the adults who don't believe the children reporting. It's the mom who doesn't want her boyfriend to be convicted. He might be the sole source of income in the house. Or, there might be domestic violence within that relationship, so the power dynamic doesn't allow her to stand up for her own child. We see lots of parents involved in child sex trafficking of their own children, whether they be using drugs or trying to get money for other reasons. So a lot of the education falls on adults in this place, and when it comes to child victims, they're never responsible for keeping themselves safe. We as adults and as a society are responsible for that, and it does start with their own parents and their own families, who might know, oh, grandpa did that to me too. We just don't talk about that in our family. In certain communities and certain cultures, that generational trauma is known, but we can't report that, because we want to keep it at home. We can't have him go to prison. We want to protect our family member. So it's a layered onion that, just keeps blossoming the more you pull back those layers. But the vast majority of people, adult or child, are offended against by someone they know. And that's why when we talk about sexual violence prevention and teaching self-defense and things like that, we have to ask, are you willing to punch your uncle in the face? Can you kick your boyfriend in the groin? Because that's what it is. But we need to be educating boys and men more than we are girls and women. And starting with, young kids and talking about autonomy in their bodies and consent and who they can touch and what they show to each other. And it starts very young, and how we even deal with our boys and girls, to say things like boys will be boys and that's just how they are, and girls should be quiet. So we're also kind of perpetuating these stereotypes around victim and perpetrator.
I would agree with you on that. And with the new era of technology, with the phones and computers, that just really adds even a different and more of a layer, and adds more complexity, I think, to the issue as well.
Yes.
I read this, and it really kind of just, for me, just kind of horned in. If anybody have questions, please feel free to hit your mic, and I acknowledge you. It says, harm from sex crimes stay with most victims for the rest of their lives, affecting their psychic, interpersonal relationships, being physical, and usually their sex lives. It is only understandable that those who are affected by such abusers want their offenders to suffer. And when I started reading how this affects, and I'm thinking about especially young children, because this bill is dealing with children under the age of 13, most people never can recover from whatever act that has happened to them. Some people are able to live through it, but a lot of people really have a hard time just struggling and overcoming it. What I'm continuing to learn, it appears, and I didn't see that in your information I don't think, is a lot of males are really offended,
Mm-hmm.
and oftentimes are not able or don't feel comfortable in reporting.
Right.
And that is something that truly bothers me.
Yeah. Yeah, when we look at victims under the age of 18, but particularly under the age of 12 or 13, there's not a lot of difference between girls and boys and the likelihood of victimization. And again, if we think about access, so boys going off to Boy Scout camp, and I'll throw the Boy Scouts out there because my husband's a Boy Scout. But going off to Boy Scout camp, it's a bunch of boys and a man. That's who has access to the child. The Catholic Church, there were not altar girls, there were altar boys. So that's who those priests who offended had access to, so that it is all about access. And when it comes to boys and girls of a young age, they're equally at risk. But girls kind of grow up with this knowledge that bad things could happen to you. Boys are not told that, or they're told, man up, you should be able to handle yourself. Are you a pussy? Are you weak? So we socialize our boys to feel like they can't come forward with things that might show that they've not been as strong as they thought they were supposed to be, when in fact they're just little boys, and they're no different than little girls. When they skin their knee, it hurts and they cry, and we tell them not to. So it starts very young. I would kind of take issue though with the categorization that most victims don't survive, or don't or can't get over or get through or heal from their offenses. Sexual assault will always stay with somebody, but it doesn't have to define them. And we know lots of people who are very successful, very healthy, happy individuals who have sexual abuse histories. The myth of the shattered victim is one that bothers me greatly. I am myself a survivor of sexual violence. I would like to think that that is one of the things that makes me better at what I do, because I understand it better than someone who just read it in a book. But it doesn't affect me in the way that I can't work with offenders, that I can't be powerful or strong or intelligent or accomplished. We can name lots of famous people as well who have sexual abuse histories, starting with Oprah Winfrey, Tyler Perry, lots of individuals, male and female, who have come forward and said, I suffered sexual abuse as a child or as a young person, and look at me today. So there's a lot, I think, that we sometimes don't give survivors credit for, and that's healing. And sometimes that's even forgiveness. You know, having worked with survivors for as long as I have, most of them, when they ask about the offender, they just want to know, is he doing this to anyone else, or has he learned, or has he changed? Very few have said, I want to kill him, or I hate him. Some do. But most just say, is he different? Does he get what he did? Is he changed? And when they hear, yes, he's successful, he has a job, he just became a father, he seems to be doing a good job with his wife and his kids, that is success for a lot of survivors. Not, that person anguishes in prison for the rest of their lives or is killed. Now, there are lots of people who feel that way too. So it's just like we can't categorize and sweep with one brush people who offend. We can't do it with victim survivors either, because they're a very diverse group of people. So I always want to put that plug in, that we're strong too, and we can heal and go on to do really great things, including the work that I'm doing.
And I would hope that that's not how my statement came across.
No, not at all.
Because I was just saying how it stays with people. Mm-hmm. Not that you can't live beyond and be successful, because you're right. There are a lot of people. Mm-hmm. I know a lot of people myself, who have been victims or survivors. Yeah. But there is something still that was stolen, especially from a child, the innocence of a child, that can never be replaced. No, that can never be replaced. No. But they can grow up. They can be successful. They can get through. But they may not never get over, right? But they get through.
Yep.
Yeah.
And their voices are important, and it's important to always have victim advocacy at the table, and survivors at the table when it comes to public policy, and that may include some of those survivors who want to remain anonymous. So, doing anonymous polls is also another way to keep their voices active in what we're doing.
I have two more questions. One was about the group that you offer. You said they come to group once a month for 2 hours.
That's correct. Yes.
And that's it?
Yeah, we used to meet twice a month for an hour before COVID. We shut down for about 3 months at the beginning of COVID, and then we resumed groups in June of 2020 with masks and distance and those kinds of things. But that was one of the accommodations that we had to make, that to keep the number of people down, and the likelihood of me as a provider seeing 30 people a night versus 10, we would keep the one group there for 2 hours once a month, as opposed to them coming twice for an hour. So that's how our program now runs. When it comes to things like changes like that, making changes in somebody's work schedule and saying you can come once a month for 2 hours, it's really hard to then reverse it back to twice a month for an hour. Best practice would be that people are meeting weekly sometimes, or more than weekly, but that just depends on that individual need. We have people in our aftercare program who come once a month for an hour, and those are people who have been in the program for more than 3 years, have completed a treatment workbook, have had at least one individual session, and can articulate their risk, how they committed their offense, what they're doing differently now, who kind of have a relapse prevention plan that they can talk about. And so and technically, or honestly, I'm looking at a way to then discharge people from treatment. But right now we don't have written policy on how to do that, because like I said, there's a maximum benefit that's going to be met. And I've had men, who are twice my age almost say, there's nothing you can teach me. I've been in prison for 50 years and I've never committed another offense. I'm 70 years old, I'm doing everything. I've been in group for 10 years. What more can you teach me? I'm just showing up and paying my money. And they start to feel like the state just wants my money. They care more about that than they care about my wellness and my life. And as a treatment provider, as somebody who has an ethical code, that starts to feel really unethical and uncomfortable for me. And as a human with empathy, it starts to feel really uncomfortable that we don't have a path to discharge or completion for folks, except when they're done with their probation. And like I said, those individuals who were at Angola for 50 years and then paroled because they were 65 or older, they're on lifetime supervision. So those men will die in my group. And that's not an appropriate use of treatment. So I think there are other kind of solutions we could look to in terms of treatment. But yes, right now, I kind of ran on. We meet once a month for 2 hours. Ideally, I would like that to be more individualized, so I could say that one person needs individual treatment and another person needs group, and at this frequency and this rate and this duration.
So, are you aware of any other programs that may offer what you're suggesting, or is
I
that
don't
pretty
know
much
the
what
other
everybody
programs
does?
in the state.
Okay.
This is there's not a lot of us that are doing this service. That's why I think Dr. Romano's catchment area is pretty large. There are people who have retired from this service and are no longer in the business, and there's not a good network. I think that Ms. Lowbray tried to reach us through the Louisiana chapter of ATSA, which is kind of defunct right now and not really working. Although
that because of COVID, or was it?
No, it never really kind of took off with people. A colleague of mine in North Louisiana is trying to get it back going. He does prison-based treatment. So we don't have a good network in our state. That's why I'm a member of Arkansas ATSA, because it allows me to kind of stay involved on a state level in what's happening, rather than just being a member of the ATSA, the national program. But I don't know. I know some programs in the state were doing what's called kind of faith-based treatment, which is not clinically empirically proven to be effective, as opposed to the cognitive behavioral and R&R treatment that we use. So I know that ours is empirically based and sound, but I don't know what other programs are offering. And again, Dr. Romano's office sees both state offenders and those offended or those convicted under federal programs that are under federal probation and parole as well as state.
What curriculum do you guys use?
We have a workbook that's called the Adult Relapse Prevention Workbook. It is written by, I can't remember her name, but Safer Society Press is a website that you can see kind of all of the curriculum. The Good Lives Model workbook is on there. Those are all empirically based workbooks.
Okay.
But it's really stressed that workbook-based work should kind of supplement what we're doing individually, and that we're kind of, catering what we're doing to more than just reading through a workbook, that we're actually meeting the needs of the individuals in there. And primary, and Ms. Lowbray knows this, primary to treatment is the relationship that people have with their treatment provider. So the counselor showing up with an empathic, attitude, wanting to be there, wanting to work with them, wanting to provide services to them, not afraid of them. Like, me showing up as a woman in that space and doing the work that I do is probably a big piece of what the work is, as opposed to what the workbook is. Because if I showed up with an attitude of, you're all bad people and you don't deserve to be on the streets, that the treatment wouldn't go very far.
So, in the world of utopia, what are the 3 most important things you would recommend? You've given a lot of recommendations here today, but what would be your top 3 that you think would be very game changers and
primary
very significant?
prevention, like education in the schools on relationships, on emotions, on managing your own emotions. Just starting there, emotional intelligence in the schools and impulse control. That would be my primary prevention effort. When it comes to treatment, I would like to see assessments and individualized assessments and treatment plans so that we can determine this person's risk level is low and maybe they only need treatment for 3 years, or maybe they only need treatment for, until they meet this goal. So I'd like to be able to do that. And again, in utopia, which this is not.
Yeah.
I would make changes to the sex offender registry. I know that all states are not following all of the guidelines of the sex offender registry. The more that we follow, the more money we get from the federal government. So the southern states follow a lot more than other states. But things like sending postcards out, the cost of that every 5 years is enormous, especially if you live in New Orleans or another like dense city, and it does nothing to protect society. It does not matter if somebody who committed a crime against their grandson lives down my street and I know about it, because I'm not likely to be a target of his ever again or ever. And his grandchild probably no longer has access to him. And he's probably not got a lot of kids in and out of his house unless his family allows that. So his neighbors knowing doesn't do anything to keep anyone safe. So things like that. I think the registry being public and it's on the internet, and if we want to look at it, we have access to it. But the cost of postcards and that kind of thing doesn't serve a whole lot of purpose in terms of safety. And we do know that there are instances of people on the sex offender registry who are killed, who are harassed, who are abused, or who lose their housing because of it. For just because of bias and prejudice. So the risk to the offender is higher than the safety to society with some of the parts of the sex offender registry.
I know some of my colleagues would definitely disagree with that because of the lack of access to internet in terms of being the tool to utilize, especially in the rural parts of our state. But okay, great. So these were some great recommendations. And again, if you can make your presentation available to us so that if anybody call and so that we can see some of this a little bit better, since it's in black and white, we would greatly appreciate it.
Yeah, I can email you that later today.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for being with us. Before she leaves the table, does anyone have any questions? I see Ms. Cosmano with DCFS, which your name was, you guys were kind of referenced. Do you guys receive calls from individuals? This is just me asking you. Or does anyone make reports to you guys about cases about when a person has maybe they're in counseling or in treatment and they confess and something comes out? I mean, are you aware of anything of that? Not
that I'm aware of, but I could look into that. I'm sorry. Not that I'm aware of, but I could certainly look into that.
I'm just wondering how often.
Information on
Yes.
that.
I'm wondering how often that happens. Okay, thank you. Ms. Lamondre?
I have a question about the assessment. So, like, what does an assessment entail?
So I'm not the expert on assessment, I'll say right off the bat. But there are tools that are measured tools, and they're empirically sound tools that can be used to measure somebody's risk of reoffending. Some of them are based only on what the person has already done. Most of them are based on that. I know that y'all were kind of talking last time about like, how could we predict somebody's risk in the future? But most of them are based on risk of the behavior that's already been committed. And what we call stable acute or stable risk factors, like the age at the time, the number of victims, the age of the victim, the relationship. There's one in particular is called the stable. I think the newest one is the stable 2007 or something like that. So there's different actuarial tools that are used by psychologists to assess somebody's risk.
So it's something that would have to be done by like a psychologist,
yes,
in particular.
Yes, or an LPC with privileges to do those kinds of assessments, and I'm not within that. I'm trying to stay out of that area.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Miss Lamondre. Again, thank you so much, Ms. Smith, for being here today, for sharing this wonderful information. And again, I would like to have a copy of your presentation in color.
Okay.
And then for anybody who would like to have a copy in color, we can make sure that you receive it.
All right.
Okay. Thank you so very much.
You're welcome.
All right. Next, we are going to call Miss Carolyn Stapleton, retired law enforcement victim advocate. Oh, that's the advocate now. And Brandon, Melissa, if y'all want to come together.
Brandy's the one that called me about this panel, and I ran off two cases that I was very familiar with. That speaks to really what you were talking about. Okay, one of them was a sex offender. He was named Eddie Orange, and I was an advocate for one of the children that he raped again in 2006. But in 1994, he pled guilty to raping relatives, both girls, and they were young children too. And he was sentenced to 30 years. And the sentence was he pled guilty to 10 counts of incest to 2 blood relatives. And the sentence was 30 years, but it was suspended with a 5-year probation. Okay? So then fast forward, and we get, that was in 1994. Fast forward to 2006, and I've got in my office little girls, again, relatives of his. The 12-year-old is pregnant. Yes. And the 13-year-old he had molested also. So here's some of what the article says. In 1994, he was sentenced to 30 years, but through a plea agreement, his sentence was suspended and he ended up on probation for 5 years. Since then, he remarried and had 3 additional children. Tuesday, which would have been in the year of 2005 and 2006, which I was a victim advocate for the sheriff's office. He was arrested after detectives say the state police crime lab positively identified Orange as the father of an infant born from a 12-year-old mother, a girl related to Orange. So yes, they do reoffend. Yes, they do get off on plea bargains. Everything you were saying. And this is a case that I was personally involved with. And he had pled guilty to 10 counts of incest on the 2 other blood relatives. So he pled guilty, and with all of that, he faced no jail time. Then I have another person, speaking about sexual predators, and his name is Tommy Mouton, that, I was familiar with through my work with Victims Advocate. I don't know if y'all are aware of him, but he was arrested and put in a state prison in 1993 for molesting a prepubescent girl. And while in prison, he created a manifesto on how to kidnap, rape, and murder children. Wow. He was fixing to get out of jail, and the DA's office was like, how do we keep this person in there? Because that goes back to chemical castration and stuff. This man was in jail, and the sickness is in their brain. So the whole time he was thinking on how he could do this again, and created a manifesto, which was found in his prison cell by one of the jailers. In the manifesto, Mouton drew pornographic pictures of children, given names such as Tanya, their ages 12 or 13. He drew pictures of children girls being dismembered on a table saw. Images and journals found in Mouton's cell in Claiborne Parish Prison depicted scenes and stories of torture. Then he went on to teach how to lure these little girls, and he described ways of capturing them from their home. In 1980, the case that he was jailed for, that he had molested a little 6-year-old over a period of 21 months. He was sentenced to 10 years, and he was going to get out. So the DA's office in Claiborne Parish found this manifesto, and they brought it before and introduced additional charges, which was pled guilty to possession of child pornography, although it was his child pornography, and he was given more time in 1994. He was released from prison in 2008. He was required to register as a sex offender for 25 years. He did not register. He was put back in jail for another 5 years in prison till 2010. And then in 2009, the legislature enacted a law requiring imprisoned convicted sex offenders to undergo an evaluation for sex offender assessment panels. Nobody has mentioned that. I mean, the acronym is SOAP. And the experts who determine whether or not the inmates are a violent sexual offenders. Since then, thousands of inmates have appeared before the panel, but only 47 have been deemed child sexual predators, of which Mr. Mouton is one in this class. This was the DA talking to the judge because he was fixing to get out again. And he was being held on bond for a $30,000 bond. And the DA was trying to get that removed because he was ordered to wear a GPS monitor for the rest of his life. And then he got out in Jefferson Parish, and within days they were looking for him. And they had to get a task force, a marshal's task force, to find him. And when they found him, he had several unused condoms and a small bottle of lubricant. And this was, the DA said, wearing the GPS monitors clearly did not work, at least in Mr. Mouton's case. So he was sentenced to life. He went through all of that, but he was let back out. And the first thing he didn't do, so for the second time for not registering, he got 20 years in prison. And that was back in I think that was back in 2013. So that means, yeah, it was 2013. He was sentenced to 20 years for that. So is he out right now? I tried to find out, but the APRIS account where you can check online to see if a prisoner, it was down for that prison. And that's quite often the case, which that's a failure for victims. A lot of times they go online to see if their prisoner is still in jail, and the jail monitoring through APRIS is down. And sometimes that's because they failed the when APRIS checks to see if the head count is right. If that head count is wrong, APRIS will shut that jail down. Yeah. So then a prisoner.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And you say that happens quite often. So.
It does happen. Yes. If there is an inaccurate count in a jail system, APRIS, who runs they call it, we have the Louisiana Automated Victim Notification System. APRIS will shut that jail down until they find out what's going on. If it's a computer glitch, or if there's somebody out and they were released, which is what that would indicate. If APRIS shows more people in the jail and the jail shows less people, even by one, they need to know who's missing, and are they really missing, or is this just a computer glitch? Because if the victim has registered online, which I did against all my victims, so I knew when the jail went down in East Baton Rouge Parish, and I was also the coordinator between APRIS and the East Baton Rouge Parish Jail. And so if our jail system went down, I was on the phone with APRIS itself, and I was also on the phone with Baton Rouge City Police Department, who ran our computer system for our jail service, although it's the sheriff's office that actually runs the jail, to find out what was going on and how soon could we get this thing back up and running. So so for this guy, for me to check to find out is he still in jail, it was down.
So this is recently, I take it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this was just a few days ago.
This brings up.
This is a lot of jails in Louisiana that they are not in compliance with APRIS. So their jail system for our Louisiana Automated Victim Notification System will be down, and victims cannot use it.
So this is our local, this is our state.
Mm-hmm. This is state jails. That's right. Mm. And another thing, though, that we had, it went down after I left the sheriff's department. But we also have a victim registration and notification form. And just a week ago, I spoke with a local law enforcement, and he was a veteran, but he had never attended one of my classes because I was around when APRS came along. I was around. We had a 1-part form, and I got it changed to a 5-part form that we use to this day. And he called it the domestic violence form. Well, he got a training over the telephone. And that form is for all victims of violent crimes, including sexual victims. So if police are still, because that's the backup, that form has 5 parts. So if police at the time that an arrest is made gets their victim, which a lot of times is children, so the parent would fill it out. And let's just say that the automated system goes down. That paper form is supposed to be torn off, and a piece of it and one of the sheets goes to the parish jail with that offender. And the other sheet goes to the clerk of court, and another sheet goes to the DA's office. Another sheet, it's 5 sheets because that form has to go 5 places immediately. And when I first started in victim services, we had a 1-sheet form. It had no instructions. And I went to the Commission on Law Enforcement, and I said, "What the heck is this?" And I'm not going to say who told me, but somebody said, "Well, it's really a gray area, it was designed to be gray." And I said, "Well, you win. It's invisible. Nobody's using it." And I had to look it up, and I did. I looked up the RS code 468141, crime victims' rights, and then I found, and it's all over the place where that form is supposed to go. And then
Happening now?
yeah, people will write. If they think it's a domestic violence form, they're clearly not going to be giving it around the state. I know Star is very active in where they're located, but what about the other parishes where they're not? So I know for a fact it's not given out to all victims. And this person, right then, by calling it the domestic violence form, he was misled. And if you read that form, it lists all the crimes that it covers, so it's on the form. And that was designed so that each sheet for law enforcement has instructions. And I called some of my friends, and that's what started the panel. And that's why we have a 5-sheet form, because it didn't exist. And when I first said, "This doesn't work," I was told, "Well, that's the way it is because it's promulgated by the Louisiana Commission on Law Enforcement." I said, "Well, this is not the last word on this." And we didn't. We had a panel and we got it changed, but still yet to stay. So let's say Lavens goes down. If this form has been filled out, it went with that accused person to jail. So when they're released, whether or not the Lavens system is up, that form should be in their jail, their jacket, and it says, "Okay, we've got a victim. This is their phone number." It has on the jail form who they're supposed to call, and then on the back it shows they're supposed to write down how many times they reached out to that person. So even if that system goes down, if they filled out the paper form, which they're supposed to do at the time of arrest, they're supposed to give the victim the option. And at the bottom of it, if the victim refuses, they can put victim refuse. That means they did their job. And so we've got a safety net there. But if the safety net's not being used, I mean, you got victims that's going to fall through the system, and the person's going to be let back out on the streets, and they're not going to be called. So, yeah, both things that you said, though, getting back to this, we've got plea bargains, and we got people that get out on it. And then if it's an incest, a person that likes to rape his own children or his little nieces or something, like they said, what did he do? He got out, he remarried, he had 3 more children. And then, fast forward, and we've got a 12-year-old pregnant and a 13-year-old that's been raped too. And then you got Tommy Mouton. I mean, a manifesto on how to dismember and how to kidnap and rape children. This is all in his mind forever and ever and ever. He will be thinking. I don't care if you castrate him, put a GPS monitor. And they said that in California, and I think it was Kentucky, They actually can, some states, this is what the DA said to the judge at that time. He said that in some states, such as California and Kansas, they have laws allowing authorities to involuntarily place people such as Mutan in mental institutions for evaluations. So that's another thing that is being done, because really it is a mental problem. It's not fixable. And with all the conferences that I attended with the Department of Justice and state, and we had experts, the one thing they all agreed on when we were at these conferences, pedophilia is a lifelong disease, not curable. It is a mental illness, but there is no medicine for it because it's in the mind. So if they can't do it the normal way to children, as you can see with Tommy Mouton, they will think of other ways to sexually violate these children. And I mean, he had thoughts of how to kill them and stuff like that, and all little girls.
So you answered my question, because I was going to ask you, so then what do we do if castration is not going to be part of the solution?
Because they're insane.
Okay, Ms. Lamondre.
Yeah, I wanted to touch on a few points about the forum, because there was, I think it was a couple of years ago, and I think I called you, Carolyn, about, we had a client at Star who, she was sexually abused as a child, and it was by her biological father, but her mom was not supportive, kind of going back to the financial support and that kind of thing. But what ended up happening is she ended up being adopted by some other family members. But her mom, because the mom filled out the form, was always the one who received notification. Well, all of a sudden, she's and I don't even remember how she found out, but some kind of way he was going to be released, but she had never received notification. So we got a process set up to where she would then start receiving notification. So my concern, though, to kind of address that point, is when children become adults, to ensure that they there's some sort of way for us
that it moves
to follow
forward
up with ensuring that. But even still, in that situation, and obviously times have changed. She's an adult now. What happened, it's the laws has changed, but that is a point I did want to make about that. And then, the other thing about filling out the form that Carolyn and I always have talked about when it comes to victim rights, we have amazing victim rights, but we have no enforcement power if they are violated. And so we don't want it to be, too punitive in nature, where it's going to cost certain things. But in the end, and, we've talked at length about the states that do have panels where you go before them if you violate a victim's right. Because the thing is, you can't overturn a sentence. You can't overturn, because of the constitutional protections against double jeopardy and all. But you can see from the news, I mean, what's the good of having these notifications and all of these ways to be present and heard as a victim if you're never going to be given the opportunity to exercise your right? And as Shannon had pointed out, one of the things we talk about at STAR all the time is justice comes in many forms. For survivors, sometimes justice is, even if it is a plea deal, they may have wanted to say a victim impact statement. They may not have wanted a life sentence, but they wanted their voice to be heard. And it is a critical part of healing. So I do, going back, and I was terrified of the things you were talking about. So of course I looked him up. It says on there, his agency is offline or not participating.
There you go.
So even still, because I'm like, oh my gosh, is this guy in
I'm going to
jail?
dot my I's and cross my T's. Morgan knows that about me. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's something?
Head shaking in the back. I'm like, please tell me. Can y'all find out? Like, is he in jail? Please? Like, tell
really,
me.
please.
Because
Jesus.
and
Isn't that a shame?
yeah, and I think that's where I think we do need to sort out, because clearly this person should never have come out of jail, and then, one of the things we also see is that perpetrators will continue to be perpetrators even in jail. And the sad thing is that in prisons, they're supposed to do an assessment for PREA purposes, so the Prison Rape Elimination Act, and too often people think, well, if you're in jail or you're a criminal, then you deserve to be raped, and that rape in any, it doesn't matter, rape is not okay in any situation. And in fact, it normalizes rape when we somehow believe it's an appropriate punishment for people who have been convicted of any crimes.
That's
It's
right.
not an appropriate punishment for anyone. It's not appropriate to happen at all. So I just wanted to get on my soapbox for a second, and I'll step off.
Well, see, I moved forward after I retired. I was hired through a grant to be a victim advocate representing victims before the Probation and Parole Board. So my job was, when hearings were coming up, I would pull up the name of the offender and I would see if they had victims registered against them. But another thing that I think is a huge glitch in our system, which I never understood, was we have this form, it stays in the jacket of the prisoner, but yet when they get into DOC, they fill out another form.
Yeah, that's right.
And they never lose the right to fill out our original form, but our original form, if filled out, follows them to DOC. So why in the heck do you have to fill out another form, which automatically, if it's in their prison jacket, should be put into the computer system? And so, of course, with my job, I could pull up the names of the victims and make sure that they were notified. And sometimes they hadn't been notified. Like what Morgan was saying, the parent would be notified. But because being the type of person I was, I would see that a child had aged out and I'd say, well, look, I need the name of your daughter because I need to know if she wants to be here. But that's me.
That's
But
you.
right. That's 20-something years, and I'm a hardcore victims advocate, and I will stand up against anybody, over something. I don't even care. So, yes, I would follow through that, but that's me. I didn't care who I had to stand up and say, this is wrong, this needs to be changed. And I'll tell you what I tripped upon with that job was that our law under the Victims Registration and Notification Form, if they filled out that form, it says you shall be notified. But then being a part of an advocate in front of the Probation and Parole Board, they had, unknowingly to me, gone into state law and wrote that the person that they were to notify was the victim of the crime of conviction. And I said, are you kidding me? You can't plea bargain away a victim, but that's what you just did. That is not, I said, you're in conflict with our victim registration and notification form, and this has to change. And I walked out on that job so that I could get legislation changed, and did.
And I was going to say, I do know for a fact that has successfully not,
I got in touch with some district attorneys, and I said, guess what? This has to stop, and this is what's going on. And at first people didn't see it. I said, you can't plea bargain away a victim, and it's in conflict with our registration form that clearly states if you fill out this form, you shall be notified. And so we went back, Morgan knows, and it was clearly written in, and I've always wondered and worried that it would be undone again because I didn't know it was messed up the first time, except that God puts you where he wants you to be.
Yeah, and just to be clear too, in case for the people who don't understand maybe what we're talking about, when you become when there's an arrest for a crime, well, obviously a lot of times there are multiple victims and there could be individual charges, but when a plea deal happens, they may take one charge and convict based on that one individual charge. So what was happening is they were saying, well, all of the other victims, even though it resulted in a plea deal, they were not allowing all of those victims to be considered for notification purposes.
And to give a victim impact statement.
Exactly. So we made sure that the law was clear.
Yeah.
That's right. I don't want to say change because, to be honest,
it
was
was just
supposed to be like that.
No, it wasn't.
It was sort of an internal thing that
I don't know how it happened, but it was in conflict with our registration form. So then, when it was redone, it was made very clear, that if they've registered with the registration form, they shall be notified by probation.
In 2017, when we did that.
I love it, and I'd been retired since 2014. So let me tell you something, they didn't like me at probation and parole, and they were the ones that got me the job. What can I say? But look, I am a victim's advocate, and I know victims' law. So when I met with them, like I said, I had my T's crossed and my I's dotted, and I knew where I was standing on firm ground. But back to some of the, you were talking about the dynamics as being a victim's advocate in my office. I did have mothers that came in, and I had them say, "Oh, well, this is just great. Now who's going to pay the bills?" I had it. I mean, little girls. And then, though, I had other mothers that they were horrified, and they wanted this to go down, and they wanted their child to be protected. So I was on the Crime Victims Board, the Louisiana State Crime Victims Board. I was on there for about 10 years. But one of the things that was perfect for me as being a claims investigator and also being on the board, I knew where there were some holes that were falling through for victims, okay? So we had, under the Crime Victims Reparations Act, we had an area of loss of support, but it was only loss of support in deaths, like if the parent was killed or something. So my very first year as being on the board, because I had been saving this up, I said, look, we need to change something. I think that loss of support, because I had two victims at that very time that the mothers, they were going to be destitute. A man worked for Baton Rouge. A man worked for a very important firm here in Baton Rouge. He was convicted of molesting his little girl. So he was losing his job, going to jail, and boom, they were losing their home, everything. But they didn't get loss of support because that wasn't part of our crime victims reparations plan. And then I had another case where the guy owned a business, and he transferred everything into his father's name. So when he went to jail, same thing happened. The mother and the children got nothing because then the dad owned everything. So I went before the board, which I was on, and I said, look, I think that loss of support should be extended to include families of incest victims, because they're not going to get Social Security and they're not going to get child support. So automatically, in an instant, they lose everything. And we got $25,000 that we can award to that family, that if they need to move and need a down payment on a new home. One of the mothers went back to school, to nursing school, and the board unanimously approved it with me. But we had to go before legislature, and I was told by Louisiana Commission on Law Enforcement, well, you got to get somebody to sponsor the bill. And I said, no problem. I will. And don't you know, I get back into my office that afternoon. This is what I tell you about God. Francis Thomas's office called me, you know him, and said that he wanted to sponsor a bill for crime victims, and he didn't know what to do, but he's never lost anything. And did I know one? I said, I have the perfect bill for you.
Sounds just like him.
Yes, and it went through unanimously. So, you're placed where you need to be in people's lives. But we got that passed unanimously, and it's a reparations to this day. But that was some of the things. I did have both types of mothers in my office, and it went both ways. And of course, as an advocate, I did everything to help them. But that's some problems I see, that Morgan sees too, that our crime victims are still facing. The form is not routinely given out by law enforcement. APRS does go down in a lot of jails. And then if the form had been filled out, the victims would be notified, because it'd be in there from DOC when the Attorney General arrest them. Not the Attorney General, the give me my word, Hiller Moore and them, when they send them to jail. Okay, that form is in there, and then when they go from there and they go to DOC, the form is going to follow them all the way through. And but if it's not given to them, if Lavens goes down, they have no way of knowing. But if it's given to them and and it says on our form, you can fill it out at any time. So say law enforcement doesn't give it, the DA's office, that was the word I was looking for, doesn't give it to you. That was a senior moment, doesn't give it to you. They can find out about it later, like through something like this, and they can say, I want to fill out my form, and they're never denied that right.
So law enforcement, I'm sorry. Are you?
I'm
I'm sorry. Are you still talking? Okay. So law enforcement does not give out the form.
They're supposed to. It starts with law enforcement. It starts at the point of arrest.
So regardless, any law enforcement. So we're talking about local, state, whatever. So that's not happening. That certainly isn't. Well, it's
It
not
is in
happening.
some places.
In some places, it's not happening all over. It's
No.
not consistent, and that's a question because I like to know why. Why?
Well, there's
isn't
some
it?
lack of training. I mean, one thing is lack of training, and another thing is lack of give a darn. I know when the form first came out, I got the first case. I mean, the first case was delivered to my office, and I know for a fact that I had a captain tell me. I mean, I walk in there and it's sitting in the corner, and I said, "What the heck? These should be in every." It should be in every squad car and everything. But he was just going to show me, well, we're not doing that. That changed. But that was the first response, and that was a person over other people. And so you take little bitty places where they don't have somebody like me as a victim's advocate who's willing to go up against a captain or something like that, or even knows the form exists. Because, I mean, all you have to do is call Louisiana Commission on Law Enforcement, and they will send you cases of it. And so I do know places where, I mean, in fact, I know places where if they book somebody into their jail, they better have that form with them, or they send them back to the victim and they say, get that form. And if the victim doesn't want to sign it, then that's what you put at the bottom of the form. The victim refused. The victim's not interested. There has to be something that shows that form was given to a victim. So it really depends on your sheriff or your police chief, and they can make it happen. Training and consequences, like Morgan said. There are places where there's consequences. There's places where if a victim's rights are not upheld, a judge is held in sanction. And I remember one of the cases that I learned about in another state, because they have an actual victims panel. And cases are reviewed if victims feel like their rights were not met, all the way up to a judge. And that judge can be fined. That judge can also be disbarred. And there was a case where a judge was being disbarred. This was many years ago when I was at a conference, and I made friends with a girl that was on the victim panel. So yes, in other states, there are consequences. There's fines, there's penalties. A judge can be removed from the bench.
We need to talk a little bit more about some of those actions or items, because you have really given us a lot of good food for thought in terms of other things that we need to look at. And so next meeting, which probably may be our last meeting, in terms of the time frame that we have, and what I will do probably going forward is I may continue this because so much has come out of this discussion in terms of where we have loose ends or gaps as it relates to services or enforcement. And so you have talked about at least three things, and so I like to understand. And so we will have DOC here. I'm going to request for them to come next month so that they can help us understand, because I like to know why the APRA system is going down and who's responsible for that. And I mean, how often is that happening?
In some jails, they don't care, months at a time, but not our jail. I mean, when it goes down, I know reporters, they will register against an offender. And so they know too when the system goes down, because if you've registered, you'll get a notification that the system has gone down. But like I said, if you're an actual victim and you were given the victim registration and notification form, that's your backup. That's the paperwork that says if he's let out, whether or not that system's working, you're going to be notified by the jail. But if you're never given the doggone form, victims don't know to ask for their rights because they don't even know they exist.
That's right. They don't know what they don't know, right?
No, they don't know what they don't know. That's why advocates are very important.
Well, Ms. Stapleton, I tell you, your testimony has been absolutely awesome, and your reference to being at the right place at the right time is so accurate, I believe. And so I thank you. Some 10 years later, you're still advocating.
I sure am. I think when it's your calling, it's your calling.
Yes, I agree with you.
And
I
that's
totally
what it
agree.
is. Yes, ma'am.
All right. Well, thank you so very much. But I have the three things I didn't even have to ask you. You gave them to me already, so I'm going to
Okay.
follow up on those.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you so much, Brandy, for inviting her to be here today.
Is this thing on? Yeah. I'm not gonna rehash everything I did at the last committee, but first of all, I'm gonna let everybody know something that's probably gonna shock even the person I'm talking about. I have more respect for the sex offender sitting in this committee than I do for the person that talked before me, even Carolyn. I have been in this building since 2008. Never once in my life on any issue from A to Z. And y'all know I'm here on pretty much anything and everything because of I'm not sitting here with a brain that looks like if my brain and skull wasn't caused by domestic violence in utero. My medical diagnosis would be a crania, and I'm about to be 40 in a few months. But because it's not natural, they say it's severe brain trauma, which was caused from my dad beating my mom when she was pregnant. People starting off their conversations insulting people that work for the state agencies. Because everybody that deals with different issues doesn't know everybody that is a victim of this situation or everybody who is a survivor. So just because the majority of some people that one person deals with has one viewpoint and deals with it one way, that's not the case for every child sex offender or child sex survivor in this state. And to say that recidivism is not common, well, DOC's model inmate is sitting in Rayburn. On the victim notification thing, the person that has kept him locked up and had him unanimously denied parole and also had his residence plan revoked in April of last year wasn't on his convicted victim. So I guess I owe the safety, and everybody owes the safety of this state in the last 3 years to the woman sitting next to me. Because my brothers were not Ty Michael Duquette's convicted victims. But I made a few phone calls thanks to stuff that she told me that I could do. And I was put on his notification list. They sent, like I said last month, they sent the notice to my mom of being deceased. I had to go through calling them, and they had sent it to my P.O. box. I went through all that. But not everybody knows about that. And also, for y'all that don't know, he's not serving a 30-year suspended sentence for being a first-time offender. Jimmy Swagger Ministries told my mother and the neighbor that caught him messing with my brothers. They knew he had victims before my two brothers. He hurt my two brothers in 1990. He wasn't convicted of the fact he's serving the suspended sentence for until 1994. That was after the media got in his face at his front door because he refused to register. He completed Teen Challenge, which was supposedly rehab, with flying colors. Judge allowed him to go there because he wanted to go there, and part of his thing was that when he got out, he wouldn't be around another minor unsupervised. Well, he went to Texas and exposed himself to a minor. Served 10 years there, and he's been back here since 2008. But recidivism does happen because God only knows how many victims that man had before my two brothers. And yes, I am one that proudly will say that I wish he could spend the rest of his life in jail because he has proven that he cannot be rehabilitated. I'm dreading the day that my informed delivery tells me he's registered for another parole hearing, even though he can't go nowhere with a residence plan because his last one got revoked. Because y'all know I have friends in Channel 2 that are going to stay on top of it till probably after he walks out of prison. But some people would feel that, you know, they're moving on with their lives is good, but some people, that's what they choose for their career, is that they want to mess with kids. And like I said, one of my brothers, ways to cope, was trying to kill himself during recess in 5th grade. And the other one chose to cope by incesting me. I have never in my life, with everything I've been through, ever got up at this table and proposed myself to be an expert to speak for every person that's walked in the shoes that I've walked in. Because everybody has different views, everybody has different experiences, and everybody has different opinions on the outcomes of stuff that happens. And people need to keep that in mind and take lessons. And like I told you, and I'm going to tell you again, stand your ground. Don't back down. And know that from people like me, you are very much appreciated for having the backbone to even address this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your testimony again, and for just kind of reiterating some of the things that we have actually talked about. Mr. Stapleton, I do want to ask you this, because if there are people who seemingly cannot be rehabilitated, if the assessment form that they take, is there something that says that these individuals cannot be rehabilitated and some other action should be taken? Are you aware of that?
Well, I know that assessment team, that according to this thing that I read, this newspaper article, that he was evaluated and was and which seeks to determine whether a person can be re-entered into society. And the judge who presided over the hearing found that Mouton was a danger to society during the 2013 hearing. Mouton was ordered to register as a sex offender, his whereabouts be tracked as a GPS for the rest of his life. Well, this same judge comes forward, and after he was let out within 3 days, they were looking for him. And the judge noted on Friday, but this was some years ago, that Mouton made no attempt, at least to alert Jefferson Parish authorities about his difficulty. They literally had to do a manhunt to find you. That's my problem with that. You sought no help. And so Mouton admitted that he was a sexual predator to them. So it was no surprise. I mean, he knew it himself. They knew it himself. So, yeah. He admitted it. He claimed it. And like I said, you got a couple other states that they're seeing them as mentally ill for life. And then they're putting them in institutions. But that's just one person, like I said, that I knew about, Tommy Mouton.
Are we doing anything? Are we doing anything like that, of that magnitude, when we know, or individuals have said to us that they know that they have this issue and there's no help?
No, he said it, and then he was released. And the release was lifelong GPS, which did not work. I mean, within 3 days, they were looking for him.
Okay.
So we know it doesn't work. So, no, we do not have that remedy. But some other states do. But I tell you what now, when I was doing this research, I found out where there were people challenging the lifelong GPS system, that was going against their Fourth Amendment. And so some of this stuff is being challenged. So I don't know if
I read that somewhere.
yeah. So even that kind of stuff is being challenged and being possibly overturned that we can use. And but I don't know about if a person can plead guilty to mental illness and be put in a hospital indeterminately because they are forever going to be sick, and you let them out. That's what they're going to want to do, and that's what you have with sexual predators. And look, Eddie Orange, I mean, all he did was he was sentenced to 30 years. He got 5 years probation, and he just created some more victims. There's nothing to stop people from procreating, and if they like incest, to have children. So you got two different kinds that can be lifelong offenders, and the consequences are horrible.
Okay, well, thank you both. Thank you so much again, Brandy, for inviting Miss Stapleton. Thank you for coming, and I hope that you come to our next hearing, because again, there are some questions and some things that you have brought up that I would like to ask them about and look at those, maybe that being part of the solution or part of my packet going forward in terms of legislation.
And one thing more that I had written down that I didn't bring up is truth in sentencing. I mean, because I was a victim's advocate on the front end, but when I became a victim's advocate on the back end, when these people would show up for probation and parole hearings, their shock was he was sentenced to 20 years. He's only been in there 14 years, or he's only been in there 11 years. Why am I here now? Nobody told me that there would be good time and all this other stuff that would cut that sentencing down. So victims are not told up front. Now, you know, this 20-year sentence only means such and such. So truth in sentencing, we have legal jargon that only lawyers and legislators understand. A victim doesn't even know when they go in the courtroom why that's the defendant's area. Because the first thing they would say to me is, I'm the defendant. I'm the one that needs to be defended. Why are they called the defendant? And so, you know, you have this confusion, and then so you have the truth in sentencing and that. And then another term, hard labor. I had a guy that 4 family members, he killed his 3 children and his wife, which was next to kin to this man. And he said, the DA told me I held his hand in my life for death. But he got 4 life sentences. Okay, this is a different type of crime, but this is what happens in all crimes. And he said, the DA said he'll be in for life, okay, at hard labor. So this man asked me, I want to know what he's doing. Now he thinks he's outside with a hoe. And I had to tell him, I said, you know, I hate to tell you this, I doubt very seriously if what you're thinking is what's happening. He said, no, hard labor. I want to know what he's doing. And so what did I have to do to come back? I had to come back and tell him he was in the chaplain's program. And so can I tell you, this man was just about destroyed. So they don't understand what they're hearing when they're told. They may tell them the absolute legal jargon truth, but it's not the reality truth. And I think we need to address some things that fall in the gap for victims, because they're not legal people. They are coming into a courtroom and they are being bombarded by all of this stuff, and they don't even know where to turn. So the victims' rights issue is something that could really be addressed with our pedophiles and stuff, but all across our victims' rights issues for every type of violent crime. Victims need to really understand their rights and what these words mean when they're hearing them. That was another thing. Sorry.
But you bring up a very good point, very valid as well, and we need to figure out who should be responsible for doing that. And how do we do that? What does that look like? Yeah. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate both of you.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, ma'am. And again, I hope that you guys are able to come back next month. And now we are going to hear from David Ferris with the Louisiana Department of Justice. And I had the awesome opportunity to hear him over the weekend with the Women Caucus. And his testimony and his what he shared with us was just jaw dropping, life changing. And I told him that he needs to speak all over the state, especially to parents in terms of things that we need to be aware of. And then joining him is Erica McEllen, and also with the Louisiana Department of Justice. And so you have checked off, I'm present and we'll provide information, but we're going to ask you to speak. And certainly I know that you guys have heard so much today that you probably would like to comment on. So we're going to start ladies first, or?
Well, I'll go ahead and start and actually give you guys an update.
Okay.
There was two things that were addressed in the last conversation that people were questioning as to what was the current status.
Yes. Yes. Thank
Currently,
you.
13 different facilities are offline at the moment. That ranges from sheriff's office to police departments to different things like that. And in reference to what is the current status of, I believe, Tommy Mouton.
Mm-hmm.
So he was released March 2nd of last year from Angola and immediately committed to Villa Feliciana, which is a secured mental institution in, I believe, West Feliciana? East Feliciana.
Yeah.
And we're still trying to figure out whether that was a court-ordered commitment or whether that was a end-of-sentence voluntary commitment. Most likely, based upon the notes that we're seeing, is most likely a court-ordered transfer from Angola to this mental institution. So I don't know the term of service there, whether he would ever get out, what that process looks like, but that's where he's currently residing.
I'm just shaking my head. Just go ahead, because something else come to mind that I talked to you about in terms of.
Okay, to give you the 2-second version of who I am and what we do for the Attorney General's office. So my name is David Ferris. Again, my job role is I'm the supervisory special agent over the cyber crimes unit. In addition to that, I am the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force Commander for the state. So that role encompasses basically essentially every internet crime against children that comes into the state of Louisiana. We were speaking Saturday, and I was giving the senator a brief kind of update on the state of internet crimes in the state of Louisiana. And without the pretty charts and everything in front of us, I'll just give you the 2-second version of that. And about 3 years ago, we received about 2,000 cases a year. About COVID started happening, and somewhere along this line, we decided it was a great idea to put people in their houses, not let them go anywhere, put them behind computers, put kids on the same internet, and expect bad things not to happen. That number went from about 2,500 2 years ago to we're right at 6,000 cases this year. And what I told the senator was we have 6 agents. So 6,000 cases for 6 agents means I have 1,000 cases per agent. This is not what you guys want to hear, but this is the reality of where we are. This is a war and we're losing it. And it simply boils down to there's more offenses and more crimes than we can possibly handle. So the mission of this committee is even more important than you guys could ever imagine, because we're looking at a situation of not, and a lot of the different testimony I heard, and I don't want to take anything from anybody else, but most of that testimony was, okay, great. He's been arrested, he's been convicted, now what do we do? But that's not the purpose of this body. The purpose of this body is to step back and say, what can we do to make this not ever happen? How do we prevent that victim from ever becoming a victim? Guys, I don't have all the right answers. I'll tell you, I don't have the PhDs behind my names. I'll tell you that I'm not the attorney. I don't sit on the head of any department. I'm just telling you from the boots on the ground what I see working these cases. And it is an incredibly difficult task that you guys have been given. One really unique aspect of my job is we work internet crimes against children. And so what that looks like for us, it's as close as you could possibly get to a Minority Report situation. And the movie Minority Report is the thought crimes. You're arresting people before the crime actually occurs. You're looking into the private thoughts of individuals and what they're willing to say online in a private chat room, or what they're willing to share with an individual that they assume will never be seen by light. I asked the congressman this weekend, senator this weekend, I'll go back to that statement. I absolutely think this conversation has to be a twofold approach. We absolutely have to have that preventative measure. We have to have the counseling. We have to have the victim advocate side as well as the victim information side. We have to empower these individuals to not become victims to begin with. But once they become victims, what do they do with that information? As well as with these offenders, I've heard a number of different guys we've interviewed say, I wish I had a place I could go to and talk to. Now, I don't know if that's because they're in handcuffs sitting in the back of our interview room that they're saying, I wish I could have talked to somebody before. I might not have done this. I couldn't tell you that. But I've heard that a number of times. I can also tell you that that aspect of this is only one aspect of it. It's trust but verify situation. If we simply focus all of our eggs in one basket and simply say we are going to provide everything on the counseling, everything on this, and just assume that's going to work, then we're setting ourselves up for failure. Because we have to have that second component of, whether some people agree with it or not, the strict sex offender registries, the precaution to society. One statement that I don't want to get adversarial with, but I take huge difference in, is that these sex offender registries cause more harm to the offender than they would the potential safety of society. Delicately saying this, the moment you have committed that offense against a child, I'm not saying you are not part of society. I'm not saying you cannot be a very advocate or a very instrumental part of society. I'm saying you have chosen in that action to give up some of your rights. And that right may simply be, you know what, it sucks, but my face is on a postcard. But I cannot step back and say that that postcard or that registration requirement is more damaging to the offender than how many victims we might have saved. And this is going to be one of those negatives you can never prove. This is what my case, this is what my job is working cases where we arrest people for crimes online, but how many kids did we save in that process? And that's a number that you can never quantify, because that's an offender that has not actually offended on a child, or that has never been disclosed of. This is a huge misnomer in any conversation we talk about with sex offenders, and all the studies you hear about. Most of what you've just heard was in reference to recidivism rates after conviction, counseling and group therapy, and absolutely. But what we have to understand is the vast majority of offenders, again, I was harping on, in my own mind, some of the speakers for making generalizations, so I'm going to try to do this, not to do the same thing. But the studies have shown that quite a few of these offenders, the majority of these offenders, when they get arrested, that's not their first offense. That's not even the first time they've gotten caught. Because if you look at the stats of our criminal justice system, it's between 2 and 13% of offenders that are arrested. Those cases actually end up, I'm sorry, it's like 29% actually end up in an actual conviction. And so when we end up with a situation of these cases are coming forward, the offenses are coming forward to police, how many offenses occurred prior to that offense ever coming to a police officer? And at that point in time, what's the actual conviction rate? And we're talking less than a third of sex offenses are actual conviction rate. So if we start this process discussing the conviction rate, and that's how we're going to judge these offenders by, then you're already missing 2/3 of offenders, if not more, based upon our entire conversation. So we have to take this on as a whole, and we have to step back and say, yes, that study is great, but there's 50 other studies that counter that study. Those studies are so wide that I would just caution this body to not to put all the eggs in one basket on one study, because there are so many of them out there that will contradict depending upon what you look at. I mean, the old adage is like 97.6% of stats are made up. Well, I mean, the same thing happens with scientific studies. Is I can find a doctor that will say one thing and he's going to find his study. Or based upon the method he uses for this study, he's going to get certain results. Mm-hmm. And so there absolutely has to be the scientific and therapeutic approach to it, but that can't be the only approach to what we're talking about. There's a concern with the law enforcement community where, and I'll be blunt with this, this is where I see the burnout in my unit. is there are so many cases. It's a tidal wave of tragedy where we sit back and I've got these 6 guys killing themselves. They ran 4 search warrants today. They're in Jefferson Parish right now running search warrants. So they ran 4 search warrants today. They're making arrests. They're doing the best they can to save these children. And what's their reward? They get to go back to their desk and see the 50 more cases that were assigned to them today. And so there is definitely a resource issue put into the preventative side of this, not only from just being able to process the rape kits, to put law enforcement officers on the street, but to actually target things like the internet side of what these individuals are doing, because that's giving you a window to their soul. Miss Erica is on our sex offender registry group. She is basically in charge of a lot of these registration processes, and she's kind of I think you explained it earlier, that you were kind of the gateway to a lot of these appeals. And
if I might, Erica McClellan, I'm a prosecutor with the Attorney General's office and
Pull the mic a little bit closer to you.
prosecutor with the AG's office, and I do manage our sex offender registration unit. We work closely in conjunction with state police. Again, most of my work is post-conviction when I'm not prosecuting sex offenses. And the post-conviction matters that we do, what he's referencing is that there is a mechanism that the legislature provided for tier 1 offenders. We have 3 different tiers of offenders once convicted by severity of offense, which is broken down by statute. Those that are considered in the least severe category, the tier 1 offenders that register for 15 years, have an option to seek relief of the last 5 years if they can prove that they've been compliant with all of their registration and notification requirements for the first 10 years. And it's not just a passage of time. And in a way, we've been sort of designated by the legislature as gatekeepers along with state police to do these comprehensive reviews of the offenders who file these petitions to make sure that they've adhered to all of the compliance requirements and actually sustained a clean record for the requisite time. And one of those requirements is that the offender has to have successfully completed an appropriate sex offender treatment program. And what it's referencing is something that came in through Act 848 under the Department of Health and Hospitals, and I don't recall the exact year, but it provides an entire database of psychological registered treatment providers for sex offenders specifically that can assess recidivism rates, work with them individually and or in groups on addressing the reasons behind why they commit offenses, and consider working with them on how to come up with a plan to obviously not recidivate, but also develop a way to go through life managing those issues. And you know, the process for seeking this relief doesn't require a certificate necessarily from one of those treatment providers. And a lot of times the offenders that are released on parole or probation, for those lesser severe offenses, they have to attend treatment classes as a condition of probation. So they're out in the public, they're registering in the community, but while they're on probation, they have to attend these treatment classes. And I think it's subject to the court's direction as to how frequent, how often. I'm not entirely familiar with that, part of the process. But if they complete their period of probation and they complete the treatment classes while they're on probation, that has become acceptable among agencies as sufficient, and among the courts as sufficient treatment for purposes of early relief. Again, I don't know exactly what those courses entail and whether they vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction among, across the state, but I do believe they're group sessions and not individualized sessions. And whether or not that could be broadened, I'm sure depends on resources. I'm sure it depends on resources. And, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a counselor, I'm not a psychologist, but from the work that I've done in registration, it seems to me, piggybacking on what Mr. Ferris has said, that, there's definitely a mental health component there, that if we could establish a way to work with them in advance of, it's like the precognition. How do you get someone to go to treatment before they've even committed an offense that you don't know they're going to commit until they do it? And so that, I'm sure, creates one of the biggest issues that we're facing here today. So
One of the leading psychologists dealing with these types of offenders is a gentleman named Joe Sullivan from Ireland, and he does a lot of these types of training and basically spent his entire life counseling and treating sex offenders. The statements I'm making are from his research, not my own. So I mean, I'm not that smart. Essentially, what he was instructing, the way he was explaining, is that about age 13, 14, puberty is when most individuals start identifying their sexual interest. And that is not exclusive to just male, female, non-binary, any of the other ones you want to say. That also includes your sexual interest in children. So most of the individuals that he has dealt with or treated have understood that they were sexually attracted children from even in their late teens. When they began acting out on it, what their motivation was, there are so many nuances clause to this that absolutely they could be a non-preferential offender. Absolutely they could be a sadist where the act that they're getting pleasure from is the hurting of that child. There are so many different variations and motivations that this is not a one-size-fits-all treatment. And I believe that that individual side of it is as crucial a component to this as anything else. For nothing more than, if I put 20 people in a room, are they really going to, for an hour or 2 hours or 10 hours a month, is that what we are going to base the safety of society on? There has to be more of a component to that. I liken this, and this is again from my non-educated perspective, but I liken this to almost an alcoholic situation. And please understand, I'm not saying alcoholics are pedophile or vice versa. I'm just saying that we're dealing with an addiction. We're dealing with something that an alcoholic can go to treatment. They can go to AA. They can go to counseling. They can get a support structure. But in the end of the day, they're going to step back and say, I still want to drink, but we're providing them the tools not to put themselves in that environment. We're not allowing that individual to go work in a bar because, let's just face it, if I have an alcoholic who's a bar back, he's going to start drinking at some point in time probably. In that same notion, we have to have those safeguards in place on both sides of it. This is not a situation where I can take an individual and put him through X amount of counseling, and then this is just kind of wave our hands of him and he's now done. For this reason, this is my thought process on this, is the body that's sitting in front of me. If I were to say, how much counseling would it take, as a counselor, I'm going to put you through group sessions, individual sessions, it doesn't matter. How much counseling could I give you for you to believe that it is okay for you to have sex with a child? And the body sitting back looking here would say that there's no amount of counseling you could be put through. There's no amount of therapy I could give you to convince you that society is wrong and raping a child is good. So why would we then assume that the vice versa is accurate? Now, I will say, absolutely, there are hundreds of motivations for offending, and there's all kinds of different circumstances. You have the husband, the wife, the couple, like all these things you guys have already heard today. But when we take this approach, we must be incredibly cautious with that step, that we are not saying that is what we are approaching, and we're foregoing the protection of society, because those components must be working in tandem. And if they don't work in tandem, if one fails, the other one's going to fail as well. So as we go forward with this process, this almost has to be a holistic approach where we are building up a number of different factors. I can tell you, I've heard courts mentioned a couple times. I have been in a number of cases where the individual who was arrested for thousands of images of prepubescent child porn, watching videos and images of 6, 7, 8-year-old kids being raped, was allowed to plead guilty to computer tampering because the DA wanted to, or the ADA wanted to get it off his docket, and the individual would not plead to a sex offense. So that individual who spent years collecting child porn or child sexual abuse material isn't even in this conversation, because he is nowhere to be found on any registry. He's never seen a single counselor, because his crime was computer tampering. So if we are looking at this solely from a perspective of what he pled guilty to, then we are missing a large portion of our true offenders. So, ladies and gentlemen, I appreciate your time, and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions you may have. Again, this is from a boots on the ground perspective, not I'm treating offenders on a regular basis or I'm advocating for a victim on a regular basis. But I can just tell you what we are seeing and how the approach is coming.
I was intrigued with your presentation at our retreat, and just listening to the both of you, kind of like you guys almost are like the icing on the testimony here today, has almost brought this whole thing full circle, have my mind going about 50 million different directions at the same time, because things have changed. And so one of the things that I know we heard early on in terms of the victims normally being someone that's in the immediate family, but because technology is now part of our world, that could be really alternating and changing because of the level of access and the ability in children who may want to feel a part of, or feeling lonely, or whatever is going on with the child who somebody they think is their age but it's an adult, reaches out to them and begins to lure them in and build trust with them, and then all of a sudden they find themselves in a particular situation. And I'm so that was one of the things that was said earlier. Then certainly one of the things that you talked about, Miss Erica, in terms of the labeling, and that was something we talked about in our last hearing, like how do you know, right? And so we want to be careful with that, but at the same time, just as you stated, in terms of what the science say in terms of people who kind of identify early on by the age of 13, how do we begin to connect those dots are very important. And I don't know if you have the answer, but I think that is part of what we need to be making sure that we do. I mean, just yesterday, I think in Livingston, the councilman, with his own money, looked into their library system, right? And the access that young people are having in terms of being able to go on and look at pornography sites. That was very troubling. I'm going like, where else is this happening? I mean, our world has certainly changed a whole lot, and I think the way that we look at it has to be completely different, and we have to make sure that it has to be a holistic approach.
I think one of the statements I made to you on Saturday fits that comment very well, and it was something that a friend told me when I became a father just recently, and he said, you can't raise your kids like you were raised because the world you were raised in doesn't exist anymore. And so if one of the most dangerous statements we could ever make is we do it this way because that's the way it's always been done. And so I think we have to be able to step outside that perspective. For instance, what is a victim? So please understand, I'm not setting this category as more of a victim than this category, but this goes to the education component, because you mentioned that the world's getting smaller with the internet. So is the victim that is being molested in her home any more of a victim than the child that's being coerced into producing child porn online by a guy 500 miles away? And I think we really get into a bad area when we start putting down this victim's more of a victim than this victim. And this is a much larger, broader issue dealing with the sexual abuse of our children. And so there's a huge education component into not only the court system. I can't tell you how many judges, and their names don't matter, have made the statement, well, it's just a picture crime. Why would I give this guy 20 years because he's just looking at pictures on his computer at his own home? Well, I mean, there's a much bigger issue dealing with that statement, in that, number one, this is not just a picture crime. You have a live child being raped somewhere. We have stopped even referring to this as child pornography. Now, legally, by legal definitions, pornography involving juvenile, but that's not really what you're looking at. You are looking at what we consider CSAM, or child sexual abuse material. You are looking at the crime scene footage of a child being raped. And that's the best way we can explain this. So is this truly just a guy sitting in his house looking for an outlet so he doesn't abuse a child? Well, this is probably an off-colored comment, but I'll make it anyway. I'm a heterosexual male, so therefore the content and the material you'd expect me to see or expect me to look at on my phone or my computer would be of women. If I was a gay male, then you'd expect me to have content or images or websites of men. So when I start finding content, images, and stories and videos of children, what am I left to assume?
Yeah.
I'm left to assume that that is the sexual interest of an individual, and given the opportunity, that individual would then act out on that opportunity. And if that is a wrong statement, it may be, but I'm not willing to take that chance with that innocent child. I will happily say I was wrong, but we still protected the child over, you know what, you're right. We probably shouldn't have segregated this individual because he wasn't going to offend, but we missed all the other ones who did offend. So
Very well said. Yeah, I agree. Before I turn the mic over to you, Ms. Lamondre, the tier system that you referred to
Yes, ma'am.
when they are released, who is responsible for that, and what does it look like, and how many tiers are there?
Sure. So it's laid out in revised statute 15541 that defines the different sex offenses that require registration in Louisiana. And subsections 542 through 544 are the bulk of the registration laws, where they break down who has to register in what way and what they have to do for registration, etc. To answer your question, there are 3 tiers, which was established in 2008 when our state substantially became compliant with SORNA and the federal requirements by overhauling our registration obligations. It used to just be 10 years for anybody who was convicted of what was defined as sex offense. In 2008, that was changed to the 3 tiers that we have now. Tier 1 offenders register for 15 years, and most commonly you see those are indecent behavior with a juvenile, carnal knowledge of a juvenile, obscenity under a particular subsection that requires registration, felony contrib to the delinquency of juveniles performing sexual immoral acts. Those kinds of offenses are a 15-year registration. Tier 2 offenders register for 25 years, and this is from either the date of conviction if they're not immediately remanded to incarceration, or from the date of release from incarceration, the registration obligation begins to run. The 25-year registrations are your pornography involving juveniles, whether it's possession, distribution, production, computer-aided solicitation of a minor, molestation of a juvenile, so more severe levels of offenses, right? And as we discussed previously, the Tier 1 offenders can petition to reduce that period down to 10 years from 15 if they follow certain parameters in Statute 15544E. The Tier 2 offenders do not have that privilege. They are 25 years, period. And it is a term of compliance with each year, not just the passage of time. Tier 3 offenders register for the duration of their lifetime. Those are the most severe, and or those who have more than one sex offense conviction on separate dates. And so the lifetime registration is quarterly in-person renewals, and all offenders, regardless of tier, are required to do community notification, which are the mail-outs and postings in the local newspaper to anyone within either a 1 mile or 3/10 of a mile radius of their residence. It is once every 5 years, and if they relocate, then they have to do new notifications for the new address, and then another 5 years passes before they do them again. So in theory, for a 15-year registrant, if an offender registers initially, doesn't move, he's only going to do them once, maybe twice more if he's not relieved early for the entire duration of his 15-year registration, in theory. And so the statutes dictate, based on level of offense, what tier you fall into. As far as who determines, time frames and compliance, things like that, it's a dual effort between our office, my unit, the Sexual Predator Unit at the Attorney General's office, and the State Sex Offender Registry through Louisiana State Police. The differences are that if the offender, and this is laid out in Revised Statute 15544.2, if the offender was convicted or adjudicated of a sex offense in Louisiana, then our office has the authority to make the decision based on a review of facts and applicable law as to what tier he falls into, and or whether the obligation to register continues when that question is raised, and we do an assessment. There's a process where the offender can request further review from us once we've made a decision, and or go directly to the East Baton Rouge civil court and file a petition for declaratory judgment or injunctive relief based on any of the decisions that we make. Separately, if an offender was adjudicated or convicted out of state or federally or through the military or a tribal court, state police is responsible for assessing whether that statute of conviction has a Louisiana equivalent to the elements of the offense that would require registration in Louisiana, and then based on what the laws provide, how long that registration period would be. And that's
okay.
under 15543.1.
Okay. Very good.
Excuse me,
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm going to definitely look all those up. Okay, Ms. Lamondre.
Thank you. First, I wanted to say thank you to Erica specifically. I know you've worked with one of my colleagues, Arizola Cleaves, on a case, and actually, you may have even thought of the case y'all worked on earlier during the presentation when Shannon was talking about female and male perpetration of another victim. That once you came up, I was like, that's interesting, because I know you worked on a case like that. And thank you for your support of survivors in obtaining justice for them,
Absolutely.
in particular that case. The first thing I do want to just bring up, one of the things that was mentioned by you, Mr. David, was about, like, who are we defining as a victim? And, when you said that, it made me think of some survivors that are adults that we've seen at STAR, who they were victims of childhood sexual abuse. And because of that victimization, maybe throughout their life, they become promiscuous or engage in, have relationships that are not great, and then they get victimized again as adults, and then nobody believes them because they're told that they're promiscuous, or and I just hope everyone keeps that in mind, because really we're not seeing enough people report, we're not seeing enough convictions or arrest, or through all of that whole thing, because survivors are not being believed, and we need to start by believing. And I hope that is a resolution. We typically do a Start by Believing Day. It's the first Wednesday of April each year, where it's a public campaign to just, it's not saying that we don't allow for people who are accused to be presumed innocent. What it is saying is, we don't presume that a victim is guilty, and we go where the facts lead us. And the harsh reality that we talk to survivors about is that sometimes, because this is a private crime, there isn't enough evidence to make an arrest, there isn't enough evidence to prosecute, and there isn't enough evidence to result in a conviction. And being upfront with them about that and making sure that they still know that we believe them goes a lot further. And what we do know from research on victims is that they typically can be more traumatized through the reporting and investigation process than the original crime ever was on them. And I think that what are we doing to make sure that survivors can go through this process? Because if we're damaging somebody so much as an individual going through a process, especially a child, we need to think about what that looks like, and where, at what cost are we, I guess, trying to take care of public safety. The other thing is, the difference of the worlds we live in. That's true that there are certain things that are crazy now about our world that we live in, but I'm glad that we're in a world now where we can actually talk about this out loud, because a lot of times, this just was not at all dealt with in families. All we thought about, you were told, growing up, stranger danger, right? I just remember that, don't take candy from strangers. I know everyone in school, if there's somebody in a van, that's what we were taught. So I'm glad that we're open to having the conversation, because it was not looked at as something you talked about. And then the other thing about prosecutions, and in particular the plea deals, whose responsibility is it ultimately? Because one of the things that, to me, this comes down to, and I am most concerned about the perpetrators I see who are serial rapists. And David Lisak, he's a great researcher. He coined the term undetected rapists. Mm-hmm. And on average, his study was people who had never been arrested, never been accused officially, but on average, they raped 6 times. But the reason they went undetected for so long typically is because they use alcohol to facilitate rape. They choose people who they believe won't be believed. And they're the ones who are hunting and preying on LSU and Southern's campuses all the time. And even in his study, even though they did sexually offend against adults, they also offended against children as well. And those are the people that have means and are privileged. And so they're the ones, to me, who I see not at all being reported, but if they are, the deals that they're able to get. So it's like, it's the perception of who we believe is an offender and what they look like. It's not the masked man jumping out of the bushes. It's,
that's a very good point.
John Smith, who just looks like an upstanding citizen and probably donates to charities. And, we have to also stop calling sex offenders monsters, because when we do that, we make it believe like we know what they would look like and they would be the creepy guy, and that's not who they are. They're amongst us, and they are people who are charming. So I just also do believe that there are people who can rehabilitate, and I think we need to be very clear about who we're likely to offend again versus not. And for the people who we do see good support systems and a track record, I do believe we have to, we can't condemn them for life forever if they have proven themselves. But I know that it gives people heartache, because it's like, how do you ever truly know? And even as a parent, for me, right? Like I'm like, would I try? I don't know the answer, but I do know that I want us to be proactive. And to me, we really need to start early in schools, teaching kids about their bodies, what's appropriate touch, and we need to be pushed back. And I want to see the AG's office with us. I wrote an op-ed because Attorney General Jeff Landry had said that he was wanting to do Louisiana off all the bad lists. And I said, I hope he stands with us for supporting comprehensive health education in schools, because I think that's where most of this, it will be a slow shift, but I do believe it's a very necessary shift. So hopefully you all will support us in those efforts.
Well, I can't speak to what that looks like, because I don't know what that is. I can tell you, though, that we spoke about this on Saturday, that education component in the schools is absolutely crucial from a number of perspectives. Number one, it's a perspective of what is not acceptable behavior. Number two is what your rights are if these acceptable behaviors or unacceptable behaviors occur. One of my biggest frustrations in this conversation with, more specifically, internet crimes, but crimes in general, is that we look at this as a female victim. And we see more, I don't want to say more, we see a number of victims that are males just like females, but we have never created an environment where that is allowed to be spoken. From day one, and this is a very general statement, but from day one, ladies are generally taught that there are bad men out there who intend to do bad things. We have never had that conversation with our young men, so we've, in essence, created a perfect victim class. And so what we are seeing from just a sexting, blackmail, extortion perspective, because that is one of the growing trends now, is kids aren't ashamed anymore, so they're sending images of themselves. And then for a female victim, it tends to be more sexually driven, where the individual is attempting to get more sexual content or arrange meetings, things of that nature. For the male victims, it is a criminal enterprise, where we have two main organizations. You have one based out of the Ivory Coast, one based, I believe, in Nigeria, that nobody's scamming you on the Nigerian lottery anymore. They're just sitting there having conversations with our young men, and they are simply convincing these young men to send images and then immediately start extorting them for cash or for Amazon gift cards. So it is a criminal enterprise. So even in this discussion of victims, like, that was meant to expand the definition, not contrast it. So this is still a victim of a sex crime, but a totally different ulterior motive. Now that's a monetary gain by a criminal organization on the other side of the world. So this is a much bigger issue than, unfortunately, one possible, this is the silver bullet solution. But education has to be part of that. And the earlier the better. We have to get into our schools and teach kids about what that from my world, for the cyber world, what that digital citizenship looks like, what is okay to say, what behaviors are appropriate or not appropriate. And this is one of my sayings I love to say to all the kids and parents I'm talking to is, again, it goes back to the world we grew up in is different. When I grew up, I got in trouble, I got grounded, I learned my lesson, I was able to make mistakes, and I was able to learn from that mistake, and that mistake went away after that. But the kids nowadays don't have that luxury. The mistakes they make now are memorialized forever on the internet or forever through conversations of text messages. And this goes straight to the heart of the conversation we're having here, is that is another tool or weapon that these individuals can now use to control these child victims or adult victims, is the fear of having this information be displayed to the world. And it would take a matter of moments to send these inappropriate videos, or in the case of alcohol, like you mentioned, does she look like she's involved in it? And then at that point in time, when he says, well, you're here on this video, I'm going to send it to all your friends if you report me. I mean, and that's just, that technology component becomes a much greater thing that we must address at a younger age if we don't expect this to become a problem.
Wow. I'm sitting here thinking, we started off talking about castration, and and to me, it is really just mushroom and blossom into something that is so much more. Not that that's not meaningful or meaty, but just something just so much more. I think that we have to really address. And there's so many more issues that I had not considered, because initially when I started out, my whole thing was, I don't want bad people doing bad things to children, period. And I felt that that would be a way to actually stop it. And so I have all this information I've been reading. And again, according to where you get it from, because there's some data that says that that there is a matter of control with it, right? And it does work with some people. Then there's some that says that it doesn't. And, you know, I'm going to tell you, the Mouton story really just kind of almost shut me down, honestly, because of a situation that we were facing in my community with someone trying to move a psychiatric facility next to a school. I mean, like, you can walk there just 10 steps away. And so I literally just almost shut down when you were talking, because I'm thinking to myself, okay, so now this is where this individual is. And if they decide to open that up, then he could possibly be right next to a school, which would be candy just laid out before him with no jar. Sometimes I just wonder what we are doing, and how do we make this better. But again, I want to say thank you. I don't want to start rambling. Certainly giving you guys more resources, because I heard you, the 4 guys that you guys sent out this morning, when they came back, they have, I forgot how many cases, but as soon as they came back, they had all these other cases that they have to go and address. So it's nonstop, right? In the world that we do live in is much different than the world that we grew up in, because the world that we grew up in, when lights came on at nighttime or at dawn, we knew to be inside the house. And we knew, as Morgan referred to, don't talk to, the strangers. But now, who are the strangers? And having to redefine all of that in the educational piece as it relates to helping our children much younger. Because they are so much smarter than we are. I mean, the technology has just have made them that way. They almost come here born knowing how to operate the device, and they don't even have to be looking for this stuff. It can just come to them. And if they don't know and no one is talking to them about it, then they can be in this whole trap, disillusion, or really in trouble with people that they've never met before. So that's a whole different conversation. But what I like to do at this point is, if anyone on the panel would like to make any comments as we begin to kind of wrap up, because initially I was just going to bring DOC here, but it sounds like now I might need to bring, I don't know, maybe certainly law enforcement, because I like to see their perspective. And you asked a question, Morgan, and I don't know if you answered, like with the plea bargains, that is done with the attorneys and district attorney. Am I correct?
So from my understanding, it is generally done between the defense attorney and the district attorney, to where that then is presented to the judge, who has to accept a plea agreement from I'll let the attorney in the room speak.
That is the general process. Usually there are concessions on either side. It's an agreement, and a lot of times that does happen because the evidence isn't strong enough to convict, or it doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but proving it beyond a reasonable doubt in the courtroom may not be that feasible or that successful. And so sometimes there may be and I can't speak for, this is just personally, there may be a perspective where it may not be the offense that was committed, but if we can at least secure a conviction for something that does require sex offender registration, that does make the victim feel heard and feel that justice is served without putting them through the trauma of testifying again in court in front of their accuser and reliving everything that happened, it may not always be the best way to go either. It's definitely a case-by-case basis, and there's really no one-size-fits-all. And I would venture to say humbly that there are probably a lot more plea agreements that take place for sex offenses than convictions of the actual charged offense for that reason. And sometimes, especially when there's a child victim, you have to consider what it's going to put that child through to go through everything in the courtroom again, and whether that's something that is in the best interest of justice.
Very well said. So I'm going to start on that end with Ms. Library. Hold on for a second. Let me get you on, and we'll just come on down.
Who shared testimony today. That are at play, but some of the things that I didn't hear today, but I think were alluded to, the backlog of rape kits. I can only speak for Orleans Parish. The majority of my profession, I've worked with survivors, and for adult and child survivors of sex crimes, it's a 2-year backlog, I think is what it is now, and they're still working on standing up a DNA facility to get through that. So, and I think Morgan had touched on the re-traumatization of survivors and what we put them through, and prolonging that process and what that looks like. And I think that also feeds into the plea bargaining and what happens there. I also wanted to bring up, you mentioned Act 848.
Yes,
I predominantly have worked with survivors, and many of them are folks that have been marginalized, formerly incarcerated people, sex workers, people who use drugs, people who don't necessarily trust police or legal systems and don't go that route. So when Senator Navarro had asked us to come back with folks that could inform the commission, I did my research. I found Act 848's website, and I found 49 providers listed. A considerable number are housed within carceral systems, and most of them don't take Medicaid. So when we're talking about the onus being on the person that needs to get that treatment, that needs to seek out an intervention for those behaviors, and the difficulty that presents, I think that's something that we also need to look at. Absolutely. And then when we're talking about folks in the sex offender registry, I've had clients who are unhoused that were on the registry back when we were criminalizing folks for crimes against nature, solicitation, which is essentially a prostitution charge with racial disparities, and now that's been ruled unconstitutional. But were unhoused because they couldn't secure housing because of their status as a sex offender. Their PO told them pick a corner, because they said, I don't know, because they had to send out another mailer because they lost their housing. And so I think that there are a lot of issues that are at play that are feeding into creating extreme areas of unsafety, holes in safety nets. So just wanted to add in, as we're identifying issues at play that are creating, I think, not only opportunities for harm, but also breakdowns in interventions that could happen to assist. I think that's important for us to highlight as well. But thanks to everybody who came out today.
Thank you so much for your comments. Very well taken. And I was taking notes on that too. Ms. Consimino from DCFS. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I do want to say thank you. Thank you for your expertise. Thank you for all of your passion, for sharing all of your time with us today. I agree with you, Senator Barra. There's so much more, I think, to really just almost sit on and think about for a few minutes. But I think we're going in the right direction. So I'm privileged to be a part of this. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. We appreciate you being here. Mr. Ringo.
Thank you very much. And yes, thank you to everyone who testified today. I think both of you who testified last really hit the nail on the head when you acknowledge the real challenges that this commission has to really meeting or fulfilling our goal of prevention, because so much of what we have been talking about is too late if we're talking about people who are already incarcerated and are coming home. And we really want to think about ways we can do that where we aren't living in Minority Report, as you alluded, as you both alluded to, and you know, without pre-convicting people, how can we match services to people who might be at risk? And I think that's such a challenge. I think the one constant thread that I heard was if we aren't unable to do that, and I guess before I would put a pin in, maybe we should look at whether there are any jurisdictions or within the United States or elsewhere who've figured out any way to match these services. And I think the first person who testified mentioned that there have been some, that there was a doctor in Germany who was very successful at identifying services for people who might self-identify as being at risk. So I'd be interested in hearing if there's any actual studies that show whether those have been successful. But I think a real challenge, the one thread I did hear, if we are unable to do that, is providing this education to children, so that to the greatest extent possible we can help children avoid being victims and know the language to use and know how to keep themselves safe and know how to help the adults in their lives help keep them safe. I think from the prevention end, that is certainly an area that I hope this commission continues to go down.
Thank you so much. Very well taken. Ms. Lamondre.
I was just going to say one other thing, too, about the Medicaid reimbursement rate. That definitely, so lots of providers don't take Medicaid, but the reimbursement rate is low. And the other thing I found out recently from a counseling friend is that there's something different, and I don't know the correct thing, but there's something different about Medicaid where they're obviously, because it is federal dollars, a little bit more stringent on record keeping, and then the time treatment can happen to where they I don't know, Medicaid like doesn't want you to have somebody on a caseload for quite as long, even if it's somebody with complex PTSD. And so providers more and more are not accepting Medicaid because of all the hassles of, one, getting reimbursed, but also if they do get reimbursed, it's much lower than private insurance. So I hope that we can also look into that, because we're going to continue to see people who won't take Medicaid at all. So
very good point. Mr. Cassidy.
Hello. I'd like to echo everyone else's sense of gratitude for everyone that came and testified today. It's, you know, taking all the comments in and trying to find an overlying theme. I definitely echo other folks' comments about prevention and education, how absolutely important it is. It's vital. What is it? An ounce of prevention? How's it go? But I mean, those idioms are an idiom for a reason, you know. And how does that look? What does that look like in our state? It has to be some sort of comprehensive sex education in schools, getting advocates before kids and talking to them about healthy relationships, about rape culture. It is a thing. People hear that phrase and they think that, and they kind of recoil at it sometimes, but it's absolutely a thing. It's the way we view each other. It's the way boys view girls, the way men view women. Sometimes that culture shift needs to happen, and it should happen at an early age. It's something that wasn't available to me as a young kid. I had to rely on the benevolence of my parents, but some people aren't as lucky to have that. So it's got to be a priority for our state to have those educational efforts. And also, we've got to put our money, where our mouth is. So if we want to help folks that already have offended, as the woman testified earlier, if we need to assess these people to figure out how long they need to be in programs, that costs money. We have to pony up for that, and also funding organizations that have advocates that need to spread the word, like LaFasa, like STAR, those who rely too heavily on federal dollars as opposed to state dollars. That's definitely something that needs to be looked at. So thanks again. Those are my comments.
Well, thank you so very much, and very well taken. Again, I do want to thank all of you, each of you, for being a part of this. And because of our tight deadline, we have to end the study commission by March 15th. I do want to walk away with something, and it, like I said, it has definitely mushroom, much bigger than what I anticipated. I really had my heart kind of really set on just going forward with that one thing, thinking that it would really solve all the problems. But and not saying that may not be still something that we look at, because we already have surgical castration on the books, and I'd like to know how many people have actually been surgically castrated. I couldn't get that information either before this meeting. So there are a lot of questions that I still personally have, and in our next meeting, I do want to ask, if you guys have anyone in particular that you would like to have. I plan to ask DOC to be here for sure, and I'm thinking now state police, but if there's someone else, please let me know so that we can make sure that we have them here. And certainly to all of our guests who came today, I know that you have so much more to do, and I know that y'all plate is extremely full. So I really thank you so much for spending half of your morning here, half of the day here, just being with us today. But if you can come back, or if you can listen and just send us notes as you're listening to us, and then again, giving us recommendations, which you have already given us a lot of recommendations, but if something else comes to mind, please let us know. This is a fiscal session, which means that we are limited to the number of bills. And so certainly I have that one bill, right? I have one bill that I was planning to use for this, but I'm trying to see if there's any way that we can work out something else, or if I can work with one of my colleagues who may have an extra bill that we can have some things filed. Because again, this is so, to me, at the crux of everything that we do. Protecting our children, to me, I believe, is our most important responsibility, because they've depend on us to do that. B, they one day will become adults, and what has happened to them will have an impact on their life. And I think it's our responsibility. So with that said, I will entertain a motion, but we will have a private meeting right quick afterwards, because I just need to huddle up right quick with you guys, just to kind of talk about like next steps, who's going to help, because I need y'all help to get the report done. But again, I want to thank y'all for coming. Do y'all have any final comments? Anything that you would like to say before leaving?
I just appreciate the time you gave us today.
Well, we thank you so very much, and certainly I'm keeping everything in mind that you have said, that both of you have said, that everybody has said. So I just want y'all to know that I've heard you. I've taken a lot of notes. I have a lot here. I'm going to try to process all of it in terms of what's first, second, third, or fourth.
Thank you, ma'am.
But again, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.